As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Well, I've said quite enough, I think, to give you an idea of Plato's ethics. Now let us turn in conclusion to the famous politics that he bases on it. And the first thing to note is that the three parts of the soul are not present in equal amounts in each person. Each man, says Plato, has a certain amount of each, but they're not equally developed in all men. The reason being that every person is simply an image or reflection of the form of man. And there are variations among the images, as there are among any reflections. Some reflect better than others. Some are more distorted by this worldly influences, more mixed with non-being. And therefore, in those people, the lower elements will be stronger. In general, we will expect, with maybe some intermediate cases, to find three general classes of men, three general types. The men in whom reason is the dominant element, and that is the philosophers. The men in whom the spirited is the dominant element, and that is the soldiers, the warriors, the military class. And the men in whom the appetites are most developed, and that is the masses in their economic capacity, business and labor, producers and workers. Now, Plato says that these distinctions among men are innate, and he tells another myth, famous myth of the metals, to illustrate. He says, imagine, for instance, that some men are born with gold in their souls. That's the philosophers. And some men are born with silver in their soul. That's the military. And some men are born with iron and brass in their souls, and that is the economic people, the majority. That's the way it is. There are these three types of men, innately so determined by the kind of spiritual metal that makes them up. Now notice, this is not necessarily hereditary. You might be a gold soul, and your children might be iron and brass. Plato does not hold that it's hereditary, but it is innate. Or the other way around, too. You could be brass and have come from a gold or silver parent.
So the big news over the weekend was that this truce between Hamas and Israel ended Friday morning, and Israel resumed its brutal assault on Gaza with just relentless airstrikes, and now they're saying they're expanding the ground operations into the south. The Israeli military said on Sunday that its ground operations have expanded to every part of the Gaza Strip and vowed that its assault on the south will be just as big as it was in the north. This is the Israeli Defense Forces Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi. He said, quote, "It will be no less powerful than the operations in northern Gaza. It will have no less results. We have the capabilities to do it in the most thorough way, and just as we did it with strength and thoroughly in the north of the Gaza Strip, we are also doing it now in the south of the Gaza Strip, and we also continue to deepen the achievements in the north of the Gaza Strip," end quote. So a lot of the airstrikes were actually still in the north, but now they've really ramped things up in the south as well. And if you remember, in the last show, I covered Blinken's visit to Israel, and what was the thing that he said he told these Israeli officials? He said that he told them to account for the civilians in southern Gaza before expanding operations there, and he also said that they could not kill as many civilians in the south as they did in the north. And here you have IDF spokesman, or sorry, not the spokesman, the head of the IDF, the Israeli military chief, saying, we're expanding it, it's going to be just as big, just as brutal as it was in the north, in the south. So it just goes to show that Israeli officials are ignoring all these warnings from the U.S. about civilian casualties. And some other news that came out over the weekend is that the U.S. has been shipping Israel 2,000-pound bombs. So while on one hand you have these U.S. officials saying that they care about civilian casualties, they're also shipping these huge, powerful bombs that Israel is using on Gaza, which is one of the most densely populated places on Earth. They're shipping them these weapons, setting no red lines. We keep hearing that it's unconditional military aid. So how could they really be concerned about these civilian casualties? So the Pentagon said on Sunday that a U.S. Navy destroyer and several commercial vessels came under attack in the Red Sea. So later on Sunday, this was first reported by the Associated Press, and then later on Sunday, U.S. Central Command kind of detailed what happened in the Red Sea. According to them, according to the U.S. military, they said that the USS Carney, which is a U.S. Navy destroyer, responded to attacks on 3 commercial vessels named the Unity Explorer, the Number 9, and the Sophie 2. CENTCOM said that the Carney shot down a total of 3 drones, including 2 that were heading in its direction. So 2 that they said appeared to be fired at this ship. And CENTCOM blamed the attacks on Yemen's Houthis, and the Houthis did announce that they attacked two of the ships, the Unity Explorer and the Number 9, but they did not mention firing on the USS Carney. There's a chance here that the Carney responded, was going around to these ships and just downed drones that were fired at the ships, and that it wasn't exactly under attack. It's not clear here what the full story is. But the fact that they're blaming the Houthis and they're claiming that the attacks were fully enabled by Iran, which there's no indication Iran was involved at all. The Houthis are aligned with Iran politically, but they're not, an Iranian proxy to the extent that people try to portray them as. They act very independently. And CENTCOM said that the U.S. will consider all appropriate responses. So this is just another area where things could really escalate. If the U.S. starts bombing the Houthis directly, or who knows what they might do if they're blaming Iran. So NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said on Saturday that the alliance must be prepared for bad news about Ukraine and urged support for continuing the proxy war against Russia. Stoltenberg said, quote, "Wars develop in phases. We have to support Ukraine in both good and bad times. We should also be prepared for bad news," end quote. Stoltenberg acknowledged Ukraine has been unable to move the front line, but claimed that Ukrainian forces were still achieving big victories. He previously argued that Ukraine was having some success because it was inflicting heavy losses on Russia, although we know Ukraine is facing a serious manpower shortage. Stoltenberg's comments came after Zelensky acknowledged to the Associated Press that the counteroffensive, Ukraine's big counteroffensive, was a failure. He said, quote, "We wanted faster results. From that perspective, unfortunately, we did not achieve the desired results, and that is a fact," end quote. Despite the lack of success, Zelensky said that he's not backing down and that the conflict is entering a second phase. He says they're going to keep going. Stoltenberg says, let's keep funding this thing. That's what Biden is saying as well, even while they're focused on Gaza. Doesn't matter. Let's just keep the war going. And Russia is also digging in for a long war. Putin ordered the military to increase its number of troops by nearly 170,000. That would bring the strength of Russia's armed forces to 1.32 million people and the overall number of Russian military personnel to about 2.2 million. Ukraine is also looking for ways to bolster its depleted forces, including by expanding the draft. The Ukrainian military wants Zelensky to sign off on a plan to lower the age of involuntary conscription for men without military experience to 25, which could add around 140,000 recruits. Right now, the rules are nobody under 27 could be conscripted if they don't have prior military service. They can volunteer to fight, obviously. So they're thinking about ways to, add to the fighting force. And, if they do this, it's going to be more young Ukrainian men who are killed or maimed in this war that could just go on for who knows how long.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
That this quite stunning and indeed quite lopsided victory, it does mean something, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the Argentinian population suddenly became libertarian. That, as in the United States, a very small percentage of the country is libertarian, but it does mean something. And Octavio, what do you think it means?
Well, I totally agree with the idea that it doesn't mean that the 55% of the people that voted for Milei are libertarians. That's unthinkable. A small percentage of them are libertarians. So, but what does this mean? It means that people have realized that the model espoused by the ruling Peronist leftist, for the people that don't know what Peronism is, some kind of leftist New Dealers kind of stuff. The people have realized that that model of a country, that economic program doesn't work anymore. It doesn't bring up good results. So they have a notion of going towards the free market, but it's just a notion. It's not a full system of ideas. And by this, I mean that they are not full. I mean, this 55%, that they are not full libertarians, of course. That would be my take on that.
Well, this was more or less what I assumed, because this would have been an absolutely revolutionary transformation of a country. But on the other hand, Jacob, I would think that if he does have some success and remains popular, that the ideas of libertarianism, whether or not he describes them that way, will come to be understood better by people. And certainly that has to be a good thing.
Yeah, I think that's true. And he does describe them that way. I mean, if you've seen these videos, he talks about anarcho-capitalism. He talks about libertarianism. He says all the kinds of things that we would say in talking to the public in Argentina. He doesn't code it. He doesn't hide it. He says very much what he is and makes it clear. And yet, and people don't, I don't think, from what I'm hearing, talking to people, don't fully understand that. But he has this extraordinary, engaging personality and this sort of cult of personality that he's developed around himself that he's used to draw attention to himself and to these ideas. And while people might not understand libertarianism or really understand free market economics, it's very easy to understand that inflation in their country is at 150% or whatever, and that prices are constantly going up in a way that they can't keep up with, and that something different has to be better. And so I get the sense that people, they recognize that they need a change. They recognize that even if they don't understand every word that's coming out of his mouth, that whatever it is, it's definitely different, and it has a certain appeal, and that's exactly the right climate apparently to get people to jump on board something like this. So I think it's the combination of difference from the status quo and just an extraordinary, captivating personality. And my understanding is that although adults aren't necessarily getting the whole philosophy, they're just kind of getting the gist of it, young people who gravitate toward new ideas are listening. And I've been told by people here on the ground that if you go to high schools, high schoolers, it turns out in Argentina of a certain age, I believe it's 16 to 18, can vote if they want to. If you're older than that, you have to vote. But if you're in high school, apparently you have the option to vote. And these kids are going to the Austrian libertarian literature to find out more about this. And so whatever goes on in the short term, it seems like the expression of these ideas is planting seeds for the long term that we can be optimistic about in any event.
Well, I would guess Octavio would have some insight into that, given that, may I disclose your age, Octavio?
Yes.
Okay, Octavio is a lad of a mere 19 years. So I rather suspect you have some sense of how younger people are thinking.
Well, yeah, younger people have realized that their previous generation has failed in giving them a future. So they have gravitated towards Milei, towards his ideas. And a very important thing that Milei did when speaking in public was to cite libertarian authors like Murray Rothbard or Ludwig von Mises or Friedrich Hayek. That's where I came from. I heard those quotes and I just Googled who were these people. And there's where I come from. And many of the younger people that I know happen to be in the same situation. In high schools, what's happening is incredible. The students are standing up to their professors, who are not usually left-leaning or outright communists. They are standing up to them and saying to them, what you're saying is wrong, according to sound economic theory. And that's incredible. And there's been I totally agree with Jacob, there's been a cultural shift. And that shift in the long term is positive, but it also depends on Milei's administration. If it is successful, then we'll see these ideas grow. People gravitate towards Austrian economics, libertarianism.
He had some choice words for his for the advertisers who are giving him grief.
If somebody's going to try to blackmail me with advertising, blackmail me with money, go fuck yourself. But go fuck yourself. Is that clear? I hope it is. Hey, Bob, if you're in the audience.
That, of course, was a direct reference to the Disney CEO. So that was Elon Musk. Now, the question, it was posed in a way where they asked him if going to Israel was like an apology tour. So I think part of that also is that they were almost kind of implying like, oh, you're being a bitch. And then he had to like kind of let them know that he's not. Anyway, there's been a wide reaction to this. And I'm sure that if you were, let's say, I don't know, let's say you were like in advertising sales or something like that for Twitter, you probably wouldn't be thrilled that the owner of the company is out there saying that. I have a little bit of a different take on it, but let's first, before we get into my take or your take, Rob, we got to go to the expert. And these days, he's someone we always look to for guidance, and he's been sorely missing in our thoughts and in our hearts. But here he was weighing in on this because he's still such a powerful voice that he's still relevant enough to keep landing on his fat little feet. So here he is, our favorite little piggy, Brian Stelter.
Bottom line here is that he can call it blackmail. He can say advertisers are trying to blackmail him. But I think what the other way to frame that would be, this is a version of a freedom of speech debate. Advertisers have a choice about where they spend money and where they don't spend money. That's what sponsors can decide. The same is true here on television with News Nation. Advertisers choose where to put their messages. That's what's happening here. It's very much a free speech issue. So he can call it blackmail, but I think this is of his own making. And he did acknowledge on stage, advertisers might kill his company. If really no one's willing to advertise on X, then that is going to kill his company. But that's the free market deciding.
Right. He wanted it to be the ultimate free speech, the home of free speech, essentially, the ultimate town square, as he talked about. But to your point now, free speech, it works both ways. And the advertisers have their free speech.
blackmail, like this whole talk, he goes, well, I wouldn't characterize it as blackmail. I'd characterize it as free markets. You're like, well, yes, blackmail, that's what it is. I mean, but like, if you're saying like, oh, I have a right to say what I want to say, like it's a free speech issue, it's like, yeah, that's kind of consistent with what blackmail is. It's like, I know something about you and I have a right to say it. So I'm going to say it unless you do X, Y, and Z for me. That is blackmailing somebody. It's also consistent with, free speech. So this is just how you want to think of it one way or the other. The point is that people like you, Brian Stelter, and everybody who thinks like you, which basically is the entire corporate media, were furious with Elon Musk before he ever did anything, when he just said, I'm going to buy Twitter to make it a free speech platform. And these giant advertisers, people like, say, Disney, who pulled a whole lot of advertising from Twitter, you can say that, oh, that's just the free market and they have a right to pull their advertising. But the reality, as we all know, is that these giant companies are completely in bed with government. And this is they're all kind of representative of the establishment. And there's actually, Vivek Ramaswamy did a very good job in his book, what was it called? Woke Capitalism, of kind of breaking a lot of this down, where these like diversity, equity, and inclusion rules don't just come out of nowhere. It's, you know what I mean? Like, it's quite often that you'll have, like, say, the people who manage the pensions of public sector workers for different states. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars worth when you add them all up. We'll only allocate that capital to companies that have these standards. And there's all this type of like, just this blob of cronyism. And so, yes, when these giant corporations are all threatening just this one social media company with pulling out their advertising, it's not exactly just like, oh, this is just a free speech and free markets issue. I don't know. Any other thoughts you have on all this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I agree 100%. It's not a free markets thing. It's pretty obvious that all these corporations are getting together and saying, we're going to involve ourselves in censorship. That's when Disney made a statement, what was it, pulling jobs out of Atlanta over abortion. Mm-hmm. And it's because of money. I can't point the direct route, but it's because of money that's injected by the Fed and who it's made available to, or what kind of protectionism you're getting from people in government, or you're getting a call from some legal group that's saying, we're going to make some trouble or waves. You got to get on board with this. This is not free market stuff. The free market solution over time is going to be if these companies get so displaced by other advertisers that come onto the platform, and because there's less competition to reach those audiences, are able to get better rates and substantial profits. So, like, for example, if an independent movie studio starts creating movies and very successfully promotes them on Twitter, or if, everyone stops buying Crest toothpaste, or if you see what happened to Bud Light or some of these other beer brands that kind of stepped into that market and said, hell yeah, I'll sell to conservatives. So, without the total grip on freedom, people like information, people like competition. And so these corporations, I think they're going to lose out long term, where they just see enough profits getting displaced as they're bidding each other up just to be on the mat of the NHL, because that's the only thing that they've deemed as safe. And so they're all competing for just to have their company name on the NHL rink, which how much of an impact does that really make? Listen, over enough time, like, I'm not afraid that Twitter's going to fold. And if you don't think other advertisers aren't going to step in because there's better rates because all these major corporations don't want to be there, that signals to me, hey, there's an opportunity. These rates are going to be lower.
There are some important points that he made in this one paragraph, and I just want to summarize them here from a post that we shared on X over the weekend. Of course, you should be following us over there at 10th Amendment. 1, governments don't like it when people are armed. Why? Because when they are, just that on its own, just merely the people being armed, can create a scenario where the people could throw off even the biggest military establishment. It's not guaranteed, but Madison is suggesting that it's possible on its own. Even against highly trained regulars, a professional, permanent standing army. 3, the Constitution is an improvement on this scenario, is his take, because it provides for local control over the militia and the state governments. He said, this 1-2 punch guarantees that no tyranny would be able to stop the people or the states, the people and the states combined. And of course, the caveat here that I keep mentioning for today is that Madison's argument is important today, and this is from another post on X, for people who tell us that because there are so many millions of firearms, a new revolution, a new war for independence from D.C. would stop the empire. Now, Madison says just the number of arms on its own and people willing to use them, it could be done, but it's not certain, especially when you're talking about the largest military empire on earth, and you really want to get the states pushing towards liberty and to nullify federal gun control into oblivion where it belongs. So the first step, he said, is the disquietude of the people. And James Madison, this is from an article that I published This is back in 2016, but I think it's decent. Probably could use a few edits, but it's pretty solid. Madison expected the people would throw a fit when the feds usurped power or tried to implement unpopular policies. So, of course, the people have to be outspoken, because if everybody keeps their mouths shut, then you can't rally to the cause. John Dickinson, the penman of the American Revolution, just as a quick aside, in his great Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania in 1767, the most widely read documents on American liberty till the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in 1776, well, he told us that concordia res parve crescunt. It's a Latin phrase that means small things grow great by concord. He was pointing out that as they were attacking New York from the British Parliament, if you turned a blind eye and you just kept your mouth shut about it, well, sooner or later they're going to use that as a precedent to come after other people. So the very smallest thing, and it still is a thing, is to raise awareness. So he was calling on the other colonies to just pass non-binding resolutions as a first step at that time, opposing the Parliament's action. Because what that does is it rallies people to the cause. It makes them aware of it. So the people do have to be very outspoken. We should never shut up about federal gun control. Well, I mean, all gun control, of course, but we're just trying to focus on this one particular strategy that uses this approach by James Madison against the federal government. And I think a lot of the state-level gun control really is funded by federal programs as well, whether it's the drug war or joint task forces or just all the federal grant funding that comes into the states. So we really have to actually kind of sever the relationships between the states and the federal government on all kinds of stuff if we really want to protect the right to keep and bear arms, our natural right of self-defense. So this first step is very straightforward. Just kind of sound off as constantly as possible about how bad all the gun control programs are. And I'm not just talking about the ones from the current dude, because those are terrible, but what about the ones from the previous dude and back and back and back and back? We're going all the way back to 1934, the National Firearms Act. None of this stuff should exist. So number two, their repugnance. So we start with the disquietude of the people, and then their repugnance and perhaps a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. And now, if you're like me, you look at this whole situation and the gun grabbers as totally disgusting, repugnant, like makes your skin crawl. You got to wash when you talk to them. And that's absolutely true. I mean, if it isn't, then, well, you're probably on the side of the gun grabbers, and that's not a good thing. But it is repugnant, but that's not how it was used in this context. When you read some of this stuff, we can go way off base if we don't actually understand the context and the definition of the words used at the time. Now, the number one, just popular dictionary of the time defined the word repugnance as, quote, disobedient, not obsequious, so not compliant. So the non-compliance of the people on the one hand, and then at the same time, a direct refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union on the other hand, which also ties in with step 4, state legislative advice, which I'll get to in a moment as well. So if you want to start, this is back to my article, if you want to stop the federal government, you have to disobey them. Madison also suggested that people would perhaps directly refuse to cooperate with federal agents. Now, if you're not complying with something, you're not always having a direct interaction with a federal agent, so you have to have that kind of 1-2 punch, because if they're not helping in enforcement, for example, and I'll cover this more as well in this episode, if the people are still complying, if they're still obeying what the feds tell them to obey, you can't nullify anything. The feds will never repeal stuff if everyone complies. So number 3 is the frowns of the executive magistracy of the state. Here, Madison envisions governors formally protesting federal actions. Governors are very popular. They get a lot of media coverage today. So when they're out there championing a cause and railing on what's coming out of Washington, D.C., it doesn't stop anything. We can't count on a single person to stop things, but we want the governor to use their kind of bully pulpit to create attention. And they won't do that unless it's popular for them. So they have to know. I mean, if there's plenty of disobedience by the people, that drives. If we think about the steps that Madison is talking about here, first, the people have to be really upset. And then they stop complying. They refuse to comply. They disobey the feds. That drives the governor to start talking about it. When the governor starts talking about it, that leads to the next step, which is legislative action. James Madison called this legislative devices, which would often be added on such occasions. And this is really important because this is, if you tie this in with his number 2, which is a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union, we can also tie that in not just with the people at large, but the states don't have to help the federal government violate your rights. The states don't have to help the federal government do anything. If it's a federal act and you think the thing should be done by the federal government should stop doing all the stuff that it's not supposed to do, so it has the funds and resources to do that. It's the stuff that it's supposed to do. But instead, they've got their kind of dirty little fingers in anything and everything that covers our entire lives. And in order to do that, they rely on the states to implement basically everything. So a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union by individuals, disobedience by the individuals, and of course by the state, saying we will not help you enforce the Gun Control Act of 1968 or the bump stock ban or whatever it is. Any of it. You could say all of it, part of it, just stuff that's coming down the line. Single issues, whatever. You just got to get the ball rolling inch by inch, as Jefferson told us, with the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. I believe that liberty, that freedom, that markets are more powerful than government over time, and when the people are on board and they can get their states to back them up, even if you just crack the door open a little bit, this sets the stage for a floodgate in the future.
Defense head calls out those who advocate isolationism and an American retreat from responsibility. Now, we're going to have to talk about that word responsibility because it's used a lot. And I read your column earlier today, and I would say if I summarize your column, I would actually use the great words of an old cartoon strip called Pogo, which is that Lloyd Austin has seen the enemy, and the enemy is us. And that's exactly what he's saying. And and at first, you'd say, well, this doesn't seem very nice. But in fact, and you touch on this, I think, in your piece today, it's kind of a good sign that he's frustrated. He's angry at non-interventionists. He calls them isolationists, but at non-interventionists. And I think why it's a good sign, Dr. Paul, because I think it shows that he's frustrated. And I think it shows if things were going well, he wouldn't have said this. He would have had no reason to single out the people who were opposed to all of these interventions if the interventions were going well. If Ukraine was swimming along and the Russians were about to have a Maidan of their own, he wouldn't be talking about it. If this mess in Israel hadn't completely devolved into a bloodbath that has a good chunk of Biden's voting base furious with him, he wouldn't be upset, he wouldn't be concerned. And the fact is that there's a growing tide of opposition to this overseas adventurism, and I think that's why Lloyd Austin brought it up, because he's getting nervous, they're starting to concern themselves, and so they need to point inward at the internal enemy.
In a way, the discussion that we want to have and continuously push the argument about bankruptcy. It's hard to spend the money if you don't have it, or you have to seal it, or you have to print it, and that causes all of our problems. But this has led to gridlock. The gridlock that we have there is really, there's people changing their minds about intervention, but they're also changing their minds or becoming more realistic that it doesn't last forever. You just can't print money forever without suffering the consequences. And so Austin even emphasizes that you guys need to pass the budget. You need to pass the budget because, and he uses it in his promotion, we need more war spending. He was very, very pointed on why we needed more war spending. And he does talk about, we have to be concerned about national security, be a good patriot. And I guess they had a pretty neat conference out there in California at Reagan Rand's, and Reagan at least had a little bit different attitude, but non-interventionism has not seen the light like it should.
But with that said, Reagan distinguished himself from today's neocons by the fact that he was willing to talk to people. I mean, we've talked about it on the show many times. He met with Gorbachev in Reykjavik at a time where it was intense personal, political vulnerability on his part. And the neocons were furious that he met with Gorbachev to try to figure out how we can end this nuclear threat. So he took a lot of personal risks for diplomacy's sake to speak with people. But if you look at today's coterie of neocons, you have someone like Blinken. He goes over to Netanyahu and says, hey, can you please stop killing so many people? Netanyahu says, no. And so Blinken says, okay, so, all right, sorry to bother you. I'm going to go home now. So that's basically how it's been working. But you interestingly enough, and I highlighted this, so we have a brain meld here. Go to the next clip. The audience was interesting that he was talking to, and maybe that explains the message. The United States must reject calls to turn away from global interests and become more isolationist, Austin told, quote, an audience of lawmakers, corporate and defense leaders, and government officials. So basically, he's telling his customers, because as everyone knows, he was on the board of Raytheon. He's eyeball deep in the military-industrial complex. He's telling his future colleagues, because you better believe as soon as he gets out of this office, he's going to put his snout right back in the trough. He's saying, hey guys, we got some problems. We got these stupid isolationists around. Don't worry, we can manage them. We'll take care of them. We're going to keep the money flowing.
But he did recognize that there were some economic problems, and we have to work to keep up full employment and keep the money flowing and keep everybody doing well. But he was claiming that it will create tens of thousands of new jobs and well distributed. They'll be in at least 30 states, and that's good. That's good for politics and good to get votes. The lobbyists like that term. Okay, spread it out, equal distribution. And they precisely mentioned an amount of $50 billion for that little jobs program. Yeah. But this idea of a jobs program, somebody said, some people believe still that war produces high employment. And I said, well, there's a little bit of truth to that, because we were in a depression, and the depression really didn't end in World War II, because people were very depressed and they were poor, but there wasn't unemployment. They drafted millions of people, to go, and many of them lost their lives. So they say, well, that's employment. And they don't distinguish the two. If you can have unemployment, but you know what? It's very easy to argue a case that you just make slaves of them, because I use the term, and I think legitimately, that when you have a draft, which we had most of our recent history, 100 years or so, we've used the draft for World War I and World II and Korea. So there are people who didn't want to go, and they were drafted. They'd say, "Oh, we're creating jobs," but they claim, "Oh no, we're talking about jobs in military plants."
Yeah.
And then, of course, the people who end up paying with the inflation and the taxes, that somebody's paying for those jobs. It'd be better off just to leave people alone.
Now, the question of politics for Plato is who should rule? To which group should we give control? Should we give it to the men in the cave? To the men who are dominated by their appetites or by the spirited element? Well, obviously not. We then simply have chaos. The group that has to receive ruling power in the state is the philosophers, because they are the only men of reason, the only ones who know the form of the good, the only ones who know what's right and how to act, the only truly just men, the only ones whose souls are healthy. All the other men are in varying degrees inherently irrational, unjust, blind, bestial. There is therefore an exact parallel for Plato between the individual soul and the state as a whole. When the lower parts dominate the individual soul, we have a rampaging sophist on a spree of self-destruction. Well, when the lower parts dominate the state, the same thing happens. And therefore, Plato is an avowed, explicit opponent of democracy or of majority rule of any kind or for any purpose. His view is, just as reason has to rule in the soul, so the men of reason, the philosophers, have to rule in the state. And just as reason must have unlimited power in the soul, it must be the absolute ruler, so the philosophers must have unlimited power in the state. They must be the absolute ruler. Philosophers, in a word, must be kings, absolute kings. And this, of course, is Plato's famous theory of the philosopher king. We will have harmony in our lives on earth, says Plato, only when philosophers assume total power, Platonic philosophers, of course, or else when some person who already has absolute power, some king, is converted to Platonism. That's the only choice, is the only way to have sanity on earth. And Plato actually in his own life tried to convert one such king to Platonism with conspicuous lack of results. After all, says Plato, why should we allow the masses any voice in ruling the country? Ruling is a specialized art. Think of it. The government is to have complete control over the fine arts, sciences, industries, foreign policies, you name it. Now, how can we open this up to untrained, uneducated, ignorant masses? Imagine what would happen if we arrived at the design of buildings in architecture by majority vote. Well, says Plato, exactly the same thing would happen if we run the state by majority vote. Virtue is knowledge. The masses don't have the virtue, don't have the knowledge, and therefore can't conduct themselves virtuously. And the other half of virtue is knowledge answers the question, but is it safe to trust philosophers with such absolute power? Oh yes, because they have absolute knowledge, and therefore they cannot misuse their power. They must act correctly, since knowledge guarantees virtue. So it's all set. By the time you get to politics, the moral to draw is you cannot argue with any philosopher. If you have accepted his conclusions in metaphysics and epistemology, by the time you get to politics, he just takes you by the hand and leads you wherever he's going, and you cannot open your mouth. The moral to draw being that it is hopeless to argue politics with someone unless you first argue metaphysics and epistemology. And once you argue metaphysics and epistemology, you would be amazed that political disagreements fall into place within minutes. Now, you might object to Plato and say, well, why have rulers at all in the sense he means? He simply plunges in and says, who should rule? You might say, well, why not let each man rule his own life by his own reason, and have the function of the state solely to protect the individual rights of each citizen from violation by force and fraud? Now, in part, the answer is that the very concept of inalienable individual rights inhere in man qua man had not yet been discovered. That is a post-Aristotelian discovery. But there's a much more important answer. Even if it had been discovered, Plato would have rejected it. Because in his view, it is impossible for most men to live their own lives rationally. They are in the cave, dominated by their appetites. They are savage barbarians at heart. Therefore, any kind of stability is possible only if there is a strong government ruled by the elite, in whom reason is the most powerful element. Now you see the progression. 1, this world is unreal. True knowledge is otherworldly. That's called rational. Plato's a rationalist, you see. 2, most men are this worldly. They're incapable of a mystic vision. Conclusion, most men are incurably irrational, helpless to live by themselves. Therefore, we need a rule by an authoritarian few who have specialized knowledge. Here, the law I mentioned earlier, mysticism leads to dictatorship. Irrationalism leads to statism.
The real problem with our foreign policy. Over the weekend, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin explained to the American people what's really wrong with U.S. foreign policy. Some might find his conclusions surprising. The U.S. standing in the world is damaged not because we spent 20 years fighting an Afghan government that had nothing to do with the attacks on 9/11. The problem has nothing to do with neocon lies about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction that led untold civilian deaths in another failed democratization mission. It's not because over the past nearly 2 years, Washington has taken more than $150 billion from the American people to fight a proxy war with Russia through Ukraine. It's not the military-industrial complex or its massive lobby and power that extends throughout Congress, the think tanks, and the media. Speaking at the Reagan National Defense Forum in California's Simi Valley, Austin finally explained the real danger to the U.S. global military empire. It's us. According to Secretary Austin, non-interventionism who advocate an American retreat from responsibility are the ones destabilizing the world, not endless neocon wars. Austin said the U.S. must continue to play the role of global military hegemon, policeman of the world, because the world will only become more dangerous if tyrants and terrorists believe that they can get away with wholesale aggression and mass slaughter. How's that for reason and logic? Austin and the interventionist elites have fact-checked 30 years of foreign policy failures and concluded, well, it would have been much worse if the non-interventionists were in charge. This is one of the biggest problems with the neocons. They are incapable of self-reflection. Each time the U.S. government follows their advice into another catastrophe, it's always someone else's fault. In this case, as Austin tells us, those at fault for U.S. foreign policy misadventures are the people who say, don't do it. What would have happened if the people who said, don't do it, were in charge of President Obama's decision to prop up al-Qaeda to overthrow Syria's secular leader, Assad? How about if the don't do it people were in charge when the neocons manufactured a human rights justification to destroy Libya? What if the don't do it people were in charge when Obama's neocons thought it would be a great idea to overthrow Ukraine's democratically elected government? Would tyrants and terrorists have gained power if Washington did not get involved? No, tyrants and terrorists got their upper hand because Washington intervened in these crises. As Austin further explained, part of the problem with U.S. is democracy itself. Our competitors don't have to operate under continuing resolutions. He complained, what a burden it is for him that the people, through their representatives, are in charge of war spending. In Congress, America First foreign policy sentiments is on the rise among conservatives, and that infuriates Austin and his ilk. He wants more billions for wars in Ukraine and Israel, and he wants it now. And our economic problems, that is our fault too. Those who try to pull up the drawbridge, Austin said, undermine the security has led to decades of prosperity. Prosperity? Has he looked at the national debt, inflation, destruction of the dollar? There is a silver lining here. The fact that Austin and the neocons are attacking us non-interventionists means that we are gaining ground. They are worried about us. This is our chance to really raise our voices. Thanks for listening.
So Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has hit out at Americans who prefer a less interventionist foreign policy, smearing them as isolationists who want to see the U.S. retreat from responsibility. So Austin, who is a former Raytheon board member, it's important to point out when we talk about him that right before he took over at the Pentagon, he was sitting on the board of Raytheon, which is one of the largest weapons makers, military contractors in the U.S. And Austin made these comments in a speech at the Reagan National Defense Forum in California on Saturday. And I have to give credit to Ron Paul and Dan McAdams for covering what Austin said in that speech in their show, or I might have missed this. I didn't. I overlooked these very interesting comments that Austin made. So he said, quote, "You know, in every generation, some Americans prefer isolation to engagement, and they try to pull up the drawbridge. They try to kick loose the cornerstone of American leadership," end quote. The Pentagon chief accused less interventionist Americans of trying to, quote, "undermine the security architecture that has produced decades of prosperity without great power war," end quote. So it's interesting that he says that there has been no great power war. Well, he's been the one that has overseen this policy, this Ukraine policy of shipping, dumping, billions and billions of dollars worth of weapons into Ukraine to fuel a proxy war with Russia, this great power, this major nuclear power. And primarily, for the most part, most people who are against the U.S. being involved in Ukraine are because it risks a great power war, because it greatly increases the chance of the U.S. and Russia, NATO and Russia fighting directly, which could quickly turn into a nuclear war. So it's just worth pointing out that he's responsible for all these increased tensions between the U.S. and another great power like Russia. And also, he's also overseeing this huge military buildup over in the Asia Pacific, increasing tensions with China. So Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, has scheduled a vote for Wednesday to advance President Biden's massive $106 billion emergency spending request that includes military aid for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, as well as additional funding for the border. This was reported by Politico. So I said $105 billion in the last story. My math was actually wrong on this bill. I should correct that in the other one. I went through each kind of itemized thing today, and it's a little over $106 billion. I thought I did that before, and it was over 105, but I guess I had it wrong. But this vote is not expected to pass. Republicans have said they would block the request if Democrats do not make certain concessions on border policies. While the bill includes $13.6 billion for border security, the GOP is looking for asylum law changes that would make it more difficult for migrants to enter the country, but a deal has not been reached. So while there's all this funding for border security, the Republicans actually want to tighten up rules and the laws when it comes to people coming in to the country. So Schumer's reasoning for scheduling a vote that will likely fail is to instill a sense of urgency for the Senate to advance funding for the war in Ukraine, Israel's assault on Gaza, and the military buildup aimed at China. Schumer said, quote, "I urge every single senator to think where we are at this moment in history. America's national security is on the line around the world, in Europe, in the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific," end quote. So Schumer also announced that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will brief senators in a video conference on Tuesday to make a fresh pitch for the U.S. to continue funding his war with Russia. The White House sent a letter to congressional leaders warning that it's running out of money to fund the proxy war in Ukraine. And this is from Shalonda D. Young. She's the head of the White House's Office of Management and Budget. She said, quote, "I want to be clear, without congressional action by the end of the year, we will run out of resources to procure more weapons and equipment for Ukraine and to provide equipment from U.S. military stocks. There is no magical pot of funding available to meet this moment. We are out of money and nearly out of time," end quote. So there actually is a magical pot of money that the Pentagon has, and that is the leftover funds that became available after they discovered an accounting error, a so-called accounting error, that overvalued previous weapons shipped to Ukraine. So that gave them $6 billion to work with. So by my count, they still have around $5 billion of that money, and that's just funding that allows them to ship weapons directly to Ukraine. But without that error, they wouldn't have any money left. So she detailed some of the numbers here. She said, quote, "As of mid-November, DoD has used 97% of the $62.3 billion it received, and state has used 100% of the $4.7 billion in military assistance that it received. Approximately $27.2 billion has been used for economic assistance and the civilian security assistance to Ukraine, which is just as essential to Ukraine's survival as military assistance. State and USAID have used 100% of this amount," end quote. So she's saying everything else is dried up besides a little bit left at the Pentagon. And she's saying that the U.S. has been sending smaller weapons packages for Ukraine because it is running out of funding. And I mentioned she uses that term again, the defense industrial base, basically saying this money is going to give more contracts to Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, all these defense contractors that are cashing in on this war. Despite all these signs that Ukraine has no chance of winning this war, they're looking to fund it for another entire year through the 2024 election. That's why they want $61 billion, because they don't want to have to worry about trying to get these funds approved again. They're very frustrated by the democratic process in the U.S.
We've been trying very hard to cultivate this America First anti-war right over the last generation here, as people are alienated from the Bush and McCain foreign policy of the past. And then and they've been gone really since, look, the real anti-war left, credit where it's due, the core of them have stayed. But the mass of the anti-war left has been AWOL since 06, before Obama even came to town, just when Pelosi won the House and Senate back in 06. Right. They climbed back in there on Cindy Sheehan's back, and the anti-war left has been pretty silent. Now they come back waving Palestinian flags and tearing down American flags and this kind of thing. And the anti-war right, the America First right, is so repelled by that now they're thinking about supporting foreign war again, just so that they're not a commie and not associated with people to their left acting like such jackasses, blocking freeways and all of these things that make decent people so angry, you know?
Yeah, well, the networked right was largely sympathetic to Israel's cause for that reason in particular. I mean, they had the similar enemies, the kind of the woke left, the people protesting in terms of raising, Palestinian flags and ripping down American flags, all that stuff really triggered them. But what happened was that the pro-Israeli faction saw any kind of delving into the kind of facts of the conflict or any kind of even lukewarm support in the networked right for Israel as kind of they started labeling it as anti-Semitism and started attacking them. If you look at Daryl's threads, whenever he looks into anything, it's like he's attacked constantly as an anti-Semite. So it's what. And they did that to Candace Owens. They did it to others, and the reaction on the networked right, the dissident right, is that they bristle when they're told they can't do something, they can't recognize facts or dig into the facts. They can't. They hate it when they're called names for no good reason other than to silence them.
Well, it's certainly crippling Joe Biden's electability here. He is down right off the bat. He was down 11 points, and it may be much more than that by the time he's done. And then this one was maybe too good to be true. I don't know. It wasn't like the most deeply sourced poll had it at 56%. But then a recent another poll, I'm sorry, I don't remember which one, John, but you've probably seen it, has 50% of American Republicans want a ceasefire. I mean, This is just incredible. I mean, their need is supposed to be jerking for Likud right now, and somehow it's malfunctioning.
Yeah, going into this conflict, Israel had 80% support with people over 65. I mean, that's the most loyal cohort. And what happens even with the nightly news and in the traditional news that those folks are consuming is that the online information flow is upstream of the traditional media's information flow. So what goes on online, what gets decided online, what gets unearthed and discovered and propagated online, eventually ends up dictating how the news covers those topics. From the language, from the information that's used, it's where they find stuff and they actually put it in, how to kind of spin it and conjugate it and approach it and frame it. So if you win online, you win the traditional news too, and that's having an effect on these older voters as well. It's just that at the current pace of events is that Israel is going to end up becoming isolated and lose the support of the United States, and the squeeze on the senators and congressmen and others who are providing kind of defensive fire for them inside U.S. political machines is going to diminish very rapidly. And what happens with BDS? I mean, I went to South Africa in the 80s and I saw the pressure they were under, justifiably so, for their former government, and being isolated to that extent is something that's not survivable, particularly for a small country.
Well, I think for Israel, the threat that they'd really be cut off from global capital is very minimal, but it's still, regardless, PDS is a huge public relations catastrophe for them because it just raises the question. First of all, you're labeling it apartheid Israel, which is accurate and can't be just explained away. And also, it just raises huge questions of controversy in some neutral Joe's mind. Why would anyone want to boycott Israel? I thought we like Israel. And then the answer is, well, therein hangs the tale, pal. Let me tell you about the occupation. Let me tell you what you don't know about why people indeed would be so upset that they would have a campaign like this. And personally, I'm against sanctions of all kinds, but I'll take the B and the D. And I know a lot of libertarians who feel the same way about that. And it is, if nothing else, it's a way of adding more people to the swarm, as you would call it, I guess, right? Or maybe you would just say raising the level of consciousness of Americans and others as to who's occupying who over there and what's the big controversy anyway. Well, I mean, our buddy Daryl pointed out that even despite the fact that Hamas's atrocity of the 7th was unparalleled, as far beyond anything they had ever done before, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people killed, civilians killed, never mind the IDF, but it was just this huge atrocity. And yet within a very short amount of time, it was not just the radical left or something, but it was consensus that you're on probation, Israel. Don't go too far. And this kind of sentiment, kind of right away, people were willing to question what they were going to do, possibly even really before they started much of the bombing campaign. People were already looking very skeptically in spite of the horror of what had just happened. So in other words, the ball has moved very far down the field already, right?
Have McNamara before him saying there were 3 million Vietnamese dead because of our war in Vietnam. Now, we talk about 8 million Jews. That was a genocide during the Third Reich. Is 3 million not enough for a genocide? I think it qualifies. And with 2 million plus in Gaza, that qualifies too. So, he was a beast. He did.
How was he responsible for the millions of deaths? Are you talking about expanding the Vietnam War into Cambodia?
That's right. Yeah. And they actually had plans to move all the way up there into North Vietnam and China. And this is a hopeful note. There were such mass demonstrations, 1 million people in Central Park, that they prevented. This prevented Kissinger and Nixon from doing this madman act as though they were going to do a nuclear bomb. Okay. And that's recounted in a wonderful documentary now, The Madman and the Movement. Look it up. I think it's available online. You really ought to see that. We give everyone hope that these demonstrations, these marches are not in vain. They often have an effect that you don't realize has the effect for years later.
What was the Madman Act that Nixon and Kissinger had contemplated, which the demonstrators in Central Park prevented?
Well, Nixon wanted the Vietnamese and the Chinese to think that he was a madman enough to use a nuclear weapon. Okay. Now, he wasn't, thank God. I hope nobody is. But he wanted that to make the communists give up. I don't know who told him that would make the communists give up. It wasn't us, okay? And he was just about to do that. Move those troops up toward Hanoi and into right onto the border of China. And these demonstrations prevented that, and that's provable. We have documents that came out just within the last year that show that these mass demonstrations had a real salutary effect and effect toward peace in the world.
Kissinger's legacy in a word or a sentence or a phrase?
Well, I think it's twofold. One, you need a basic concept of morality, so you don't do things like genocide. The other is that you need to be smart, and when you see opportunities like the Sino-Soviet conflict, you can leverage that into good policies for the United States. That's precisely what he did. And right now, we have a relationship with Russia and China where they have the long ends of this triangle now, and we are on the short end of the stick. And Kissinger didn't like that either. He complained about it, but just mildly when he was in his late 90s, just before he died.
I'm going to play an old-fashioned propaganda clip produced by the government. This is Nixon and Mao, of course, orchestrated by Kissinger. Because this is so old, the first 10 seconds of it are silent, but just be patient. You'll recognize the faces. You'll recognize the voice. You and I are of an age where we remember these things, and you'll certainly recognize government propaganda. Henry Kissinger joins President Nixon to meet with Chairman Mao in China.
Last bestowed during the first day of a state visit on former Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Dr. Henry Kissinger sits in on the talks that are animated, constructive, and frank. At the summit, face to face, two leaders who direct the destiny of 1 out of 3 persons on the earth. The gate to friendly contact, says Joe and Lai, has finally been opened.
Produced to you by your friends in Langley, Virginia.
Well, actually, Judge, that wasn't far from the truth. There was euphoria there. I mean, through very artful diplomacy and people like Chas Freeman, who were really good with language, there was a joint agreement, the Shanghai Communique, which said there's just one China, okay? That Taiwan is part of that one China. That was U.S. policy back to 1972, for God's sake. Now, I don't know why Biden doesn't get it or why these guys decide that they want to challenge China over Taiwan, but I guess it makes a lot of money for the arms manufacturers and the people who build the warships. So, that was all solved. Yeah, it was an imperfect solution, but there was one China. We recognize that. Why we're tempting the Taiwanese to declare independence or to give them the wherewithal to resist an invasion from the mainland is beyond me, other than we think we can sell more arms that way, and that we are, after all, the indispensable nation. We can work our will in any way we see fit.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Well, a lot of what you're talking about and what I'm talking about boils down to the question of whether the people who rule over us, and by that I don't necessarily mean exclusively the political class. I also mean the intellectual classes who try to rule over our minds, the people in the universities. Is it just an accident that one academic discipline after another is completely laughable and corrupt? As we've seen, I keep talking about the replication crisis, and we talked about this at our lunch, but that went way beyond psychology. That was one discipline after another, turned out to have one bogus, phony paper after another. There are certain areas of chemistry where you might be able to trust what's going on, but it's just a complete you-know-what show going on in academia. It is. So we have those people, we have the political classes. The issue is, are these people just bumbling fools who mean well, and they're trying their best to make our lives better, but they just keep misfiring? Or are they actually sinister people? And I went through they're just bumbling fools, and if only I could get them to read this textbook on economics, that would change things around. But if they were bumbling fools, wouldn't they bumble into the right thing once in a while just by accident? And yet every single elite obsession is anti-human without exception and based on propaganda. So yeah, I can't prove that they all had a meeting where they said they were going to coordinate this, but what I can prove is everything they're obsessed with runs counter to the flourishing of mankind. So that's as far as I've gone.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to pick you up on one particular point you made, they want you to believe that they're bumbling fools. That is part of the trick. Because if they can persuade people who might otherwise take action against them, that, with a few more well-written editorial pieces and a few more incisive podcasts, we can show them the light. We can change their minds. We can make them better people and effect better policies. That's part of the illusion. Stuff that kids are watching today is appalling. The stuff involving demons and sort of celebrating this kind of demonic iconography. All the symbolism they engage in, like you'll see people covering up one eye, or you'll see Madonna and people doing this. These are all Masonic / Illuminati / cult symbolisms, which indicate that they have made a pact, and the pact is they get worldly success in return for selling their souls, literally.
Well, even if you're somebody who just thinks of the devil as a metaphor, as indeed, no doubt, a lot of bad people do.
Yeah.
What I think drives at least a good many of them is simply a desire to destroy, a hatred for bourgeois normality, a real hatred of it. And where it comes from in the case of each individual can vary. Could be because of their upbringing, could be whatever, a lot of factors. But it's a desire to destroy, and it calls to mind, for me, some of the early, I'm sure you know, some of the poems that Karl Marx wrote when he was younger. And these poems are direct appeals to the devil. We laugh at that because we're sophisticated modern people. We laugh at that. But it's very revealing that what he hates about God is that God can create in a fundamental way because he creates out of nothing. And Marx says, I can create nothing. And he seeks to destroy. And it seems to me that regardless of what their relationship is to a devil or whether they think that way or not, what they're possessed of is nevertheless a devilish hatred of, frankly, things that are good and decent and normal that they want to overturn. They want chaos. They want disorder. And by interesting coincidence, it so happens the state thrives on chaos and disorder because then it will impose its own order. So, of course, it wants families pitted against each other over gender theory because it's got them right where they want them now. Because now they can be propagandizing the kids apart from the parents about their gender identity, whatever. I mean, these ideologies, just by coincidence, they all happen to serve state interests?
Yeah. If you look at what's happening in the world on every level, and particularly, I think this process accelerated during the 20th century, and it's hyper accelerated in the 21st century. And you see it affecting all sorts of things. For example, the way that classical music in the early 20th century stopped being about making beautiful melodious sounds and started being atonal and shrieky and horrible and discomforting. And you saw similar things happening in literature. You saw modernism happening. You saw James Joyce. People stopped writing great novels like War and Peace and Anna Karenina. Instead wrote this kind of edgy, jumbled up stuff that we were encouraged to think was the new thing and special. And then you look at what happened to art. You think about all the Renaissance masterpieces. You think of Bellini and so on, his paintings, and then you move forward to the kind of stuff they were doing in the early 20th century, and then in the 1950s, the CIA started funding all this kind of modern stuff by Jackson Pollock, and so suddenly squiggles and swirls and splodges were were art. I mean, how do
and
you
by the way,
compare-
anybody who thinks James made that up, this is openly acknowledged now. The idea was to make the Eastern Bloc feel like they'd fallen behind. They weren't quite avant-garde enough. Because look at all this wonderful modern art that we're doing.
Yeah.
Oh, they must have gotten a good laugh out of that one when people actually started pretending that this was all really cool and amazing. So I've made this same observation. I think other people have. That again, you look at music, you look at art, you look at literature. There's no center. Same with architecture. There's no idea that. I mean, and incidentally, even like during the Enlightenment is claiming that the universe is kind of like a machine, that human society can be ordered by reason. And the result of that, no, the Enlightenment has a lot of problems. I'm not endorsing or criticizing the Enlightenment here, but when you have that worldview, it's not a surprise that you have music that tends to be quite orderly, that follow the symphonies that follow sonata form, symmetry, all the things like that. But when that center has been knocked away, when Einstein is telling you that those things you thought were constants and those things that you thought made sense actually don't, and then you have philosophers who are reaching conclusions that, again, are making it seem like everything's meaningless. Well, how would you be surprised that the cultural manifestation of that would be chaos and ugliness?
Shalonda Young, she's the director of the OMB. I guess that's Stockman's old job, right? Shalonda wrote a letter to the administration saying, "We are out of money to support Ukraine in this fight. This isn't a next year problem," she said. "The time to help a democratic Ukraine fight against Russian aggression is now. It's time for Congress to act." Now that looks a little more political than I would suspect an OMB director would write. I don't know, Dr. Paul, maybe I'm just naive. Seems like they should be just kind of doing the numbers rather than politicking. But what she's saying is, they have not passed this emergency supplemental war appropriations for Ukraine. We're out of money for Ukraine. We got to get them money immediately because in 3 weeks, boom, it's all done. Not a penny's left for Ukraine. So I think it smacks a little bit of desperation on the part of the administration, because we have had a series of bad news pieces about Ukraine. Now, these are things that are not surprising to our viewers because our viewers are very intelligent and they have followed, as we have, people like Colonel McGregor and so many others who have said from the beginning, this is a failed enterprise. Ukraine cannot win. This is like David taking on Goliath. Cannot win. This will never go well. But of course, the neocons in D.C., Dr. Paul said, we can do it. We can take down Russia. Who cares? Remember, even Lindsey Graham says, this is the best money we've ever spent. Ukrainians are dying and the Russians are getting weak. And that's a cynical view. Well, Americans have woken up to this, and we've followed the numbers. Americans are opposed to more spending across the board. Republicans and Democrats opposed to more spending on Ukraine. And nevertheless, these people never admit that they're wrong. And so now they're desperate for more money. Now, Republicans, being Republicans, don't just stand up and say, hey, America doesn't want this. No way, Jose, we're out. No, they say, what can we get for this? What can we get if we give them a yes vote and send another $100 billion or $60 billion to Ukraine? Let's get something for it. That's how they think.
And back to the director of OMB, she said, and you essentially have repeated what she said, the Director Young argues the remaining funds are rapidly running out, the fear thing. And my thoughts when I read that, I said, why is she saying that they're running out? They've run out of those funds a long time ago. They didn't even have the funds when they started the dumb war, But that is why, the great facilitator who can print money out of thin air, the counterfeiters. That is why, this whole argument that foreign policy is separate from economic policy, you just can't do it because all the money is spent has to be printed at this rate. And, it's going up. This year, the numbers, even when I condition myself for this, the amount of debt that's going to increase this year is astounding. I mean, trillions and trillions of dollars now are just rapidly, it's on an exponential curve, and I don't think they can reverse that. The Quincy Institute, related with the responsible statecraft, the article we read came from Responsible Statecraft, but the Quincy Institute, they were quoting Bill Hartung.
Oh, yeah.
And he recently wrote, and what I'm going to address is the subject, it's this good jobs program. Everybody's employed. I've hit at that all the time because nobody seems to care as long as they get a check. And but the jobs report today, terrible. And then back a month ago, they revised. So the real significant evidence of the downturn and the recession that must come, according to Austrian theory, is it has to come to rectify all the mistakes, the inflationary mistakes, the spending, the debt, and that sort of thing. And he wrote in, Hartung had written in RS Foreign, wrote in RS, foreign military aid is not an effective jobs program. He was refuting that. And this is a close quote from Hartung. There are many ways to create more and better jobs without resorting to increased weapons spending. Virtually any form of government, I have a question on this a little bit, virtually any form of government outlay or even tax cut yield better employment. He was doing equality. This is the worst jobs program.
Yeah.
But anyway, and then I wrote down my suggestion. There are other ways that are more efficient. Let the people keep their money. And get rid of the taxes. Believe me, that would handle it. And that's what happened in 1921 when they had their depression. They just said, well, take care of it. You got your bankruptcy, deal with it. And it didn't last very long. So this is so attractive, to say it's a jobs program, people will do well. And they keep equating the creation of money as an answer, but it's the creation of wealth that matters. And we have gradually, steadily over 100 years, the wealth that we had accumulated and built into the system. And even though it was recognizable, people assume, well, we're king of the hill, we have the empire and we have the dollars. But I tell you what, the wealth is running out of it. So they're talking about wealth. Yes, they can keep printing this money, but it will not substitute for real wealth, even if they think they have to fight more wars with it. And so in a way, the market, fortunately, is going to work in our favor, that they just can't perpetuate these wars. And that's one of the major fights they have over here, because there's some in the House of Representatives that are sick and tired of sending more money to Ukraine.
There's a lot.
So you want to mention anything about the Pentagon?
Yeah, let's go on.
Pentagon can't account for a little bit, 63%. They don't know where it went.
Yeah.
They don't. That's a couple bucks.
Yeah.
Maybe you just walk out on the sidewalk, you might find it. 63% of nearly $4 trillion in assets.
Yeah.
Boy, they're doing well, But that's not wealth. That's wealth taken and converted into the assets of criminals, and the criminals who want to perpetuate their financial power and the welfare warfare state. And so far, they have done well. But news like this is very helpful, because it wouldn't take a PhD to look at this and say, well, let me see, I don't know much about math or anything, but I do know a little bit of arithmetic. That sounds like a lot of money.
We have, therefore, a three-class society, exactly parallel to the individual soul. The philosophers Plato calls the guardians, because they are the guardians of the state. And they perform all the legislative and judicial functions. And when they are properly in charge, the state as a whole has the virtue of wisdom. The military performs the executive functions. Plato calls them the auxiliaries, the assistants, you see, or helpers to the guardians. And when they have properly performed their functions, the state as a whole has virtue number 2, courage. And the masses, of course, are the third class, the economic productive class. And their primary virtue is temperance, which in this context means obedience. And when the three classes are appropriately following their proper functions, the state as a whole will have the right division of labor and the right harmony, and that will therefore be the virtue of justice. Now I say again, out of fairness to Plato, this is not a caste society. In other words, you're not necessarily in the same class as your father. He may have been a philosopher and you're going to have to be a worker, or vice versa, up and down the scale. And Plato has a whole series of tests worked out, and a whole educational program to pick out at the appropriate age who is really in which class and shunt him up and down the social scale accordingly. Now, if you're worried about philosophers abusing their absolute power, Plato's answer is in part what I alluded to: virtue is knowledge. Since these philosophers know the good, they have lost interest in everything that could possibly tempt them to abuse their power. They don't want money, fame, anything of that sort. They want only wisdom. But, says Plato, just to make assurance doubly sure that the guardians don't misuse their power, we are going to deprive them of all private property, as we have already mentioned, and therefore they couldn't be motivated by money because they're not allowed to have any money, and so all temptation is removed from their path. Now suppose that we had constructed such a Platonic state. Observe what we have. We have in effect a huge human being, like a single giant organism. We have a whole entity unto itself with all the parts of an individual human being, but blown now into huge proportions. Each of the three classes, you see, corresponding to the three parts, and all together functioning as one entity. This view is known as the organic theory of the state. The view that the state collectively is a separate and distinct organism, and that the individual has the same relation to the state that a cell on the body has to the body. And it is therefore a particularly virulent form of collectivism. It was originated by Plato. How does it relate to his metaphysics? Well, you should be able to see that point. According to Plato, individuality is not real. All that's real is universals. And as far as men are concerned, individual men, insofar as they are individual, are unreal. What is real about them is only the thing they all are the same in, and that is manness. The appearance of a whole bunch of different men, remember, simply is in the images. They are not really, metaphysically, there are not separate autonomous individuals. We are all of us simply varying reflections of one entity, and we are therefore all ultimately metaphysically identical. In a word, the unit of reality and the unit of importance is the group, the state, not the individual. In metaphysics, universals are real, particulars are illusory, which means in politics, the collective is real, the individual is illusory. This is the philosophic basis of collectivism in politics. Collectivism being the view, full collectivism being the view that the group is the unit of reality and of value. And this, by the way, is one reason among dozens why the most crucial question in philosophy is the problem of universals.
Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense, Lloyd Austin, a man who you despise, Dwight D. Eisenhower said, a theft from those who hunger, as we have it all over the country, and are not fed. Those who are cold, the homeless everywhere, and are not clothed. The world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of the laborers, the genius of the scientists, the hopes of the children. This is not a way of life at all in any true sense. Under the clouds of war, it is humanity hanging on a cross of iron.
Polling continues to show that the majority of Americans favor a lasting ceasefire in Gaza, a position the Biden administration has rejected. So the latest poll from Data for Progress found that 61% of American voters support the idea of the U.S. calling for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza and general de-escalation of violence. And this includes 76% of Democrats who were asked, 49% of Republicans, and 57% of independent or third-party voters. When presented with arguments for and against the idea of a ceasefire, so I guess they were told what either side is saying about a ceasefire, the numbers changed a little bit. 52% of respondents still supported a permanent truce, while 34% opposed the idea, and 14% said they did not know what position to take. So this poll was conducted from November 22nd to the 25th, and it surveyed 1,201 likely American voters. So an earlier poll from Data for Progress in October found stronger support for the U.S. calling for a ceasefire, with 66% of respondents in favor, but it did not use the term permanent when posing the question. That was the real big difference I saw, was that this new poll said, would you support the U.S. calling for a permanent ceasefire? And when I first saw that poll in October, honestly, I thought it was too good to be true. You know, I kind of just doubted this idea that so many Americans would like to see the U.S. call for a ceasefire, but now we've seen several polls that are showing that. There was one from Reuters Ipsos last month in November that found 68% of Americans agreed with the statement that Israel should call for a ceasefire and try to negotiate, including 3/4 of Democrats and half of Republicans. And, you know, the Biden administration's position has been, they support, pauses, as they call them, humanitarian pauses, and they supported the hostage deal truce, but they are against the idea of a permanent ceasefire. They want to continue supporting Israel's war, Israel's slaughter in Gaza, and they're doing that by shipping weapons on a near daily basis, and that includes 2,000-pound bombs and all sorts of heavy munitions that Israel's using to destroy Gaza. And of course, there's the political cover, the U.S. deploying aircraft carriers to show that they're backing Israel in the region. And despite the massive civilian casualties in Gaza, the U.S. has maintained that the military aid, all this support for Israel, is unconditional. Vitaly Klitschko, he is the mayor of Kiev, former heavyweight boxing champion, and he has said that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is turning Ukraine into an authoritarian state as public criticism of Ukrainian leadership is becoming more common. So he told Der Spiegel the other day, quote, "At some point, we will no longer be any different from Russia, where everything depends on the whim of one man," end quote. So in a separate interview, Klitschko also sided with Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Valery Zaluzhny, who was recently rebuked by Zelensky for saying the war had turned into a stalemate and that there was no chance of a breakthrough. Klitschko said, quote, "Zaluzhny told the truth. Some may not want to hear the truth, but we can't lie to our people and partners indefinitely," end quote. So saying that Zelensky is lying about the war. And Klitschko also accused Zelensky of not being prepared for Russia's February 2022 invasion. He said, quote, "People wonder why we weren't better prepared for this war, why Zelensky denied until the end that it would come to this. People see who's effective and who's not, and there were and still are a lot of expectations. Zelensky is paying for the mistakes he has made," end quote. This article's from The Hill. I thought it was fine. It's rare that we run stuff from The Hill, but kind of saw this last minute. So tempers boiled over during a classified Senate briefing on Ukraine on Tuesday afternoon when Republican senators insisted on talking about security along the U.S.-Mexico border, while Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and military officials tried to keep the discussion focused on the war. So what's interesting here is that Schumer accused Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell of attempting to hijack the meeting on Ukraine's defense needs to have an unrelated conversation on border security. So Mitch McConnell, a very staunch supporter of Ukraine, who previously said supporting Ukraine should be the #1 priority for Republicans, seems to be prioritizing the border stuff more. At least maybe he's just trying to keep people in his party happy. He definitely still wants to pass this $61 billion for Ukraine, but it looks like they're really trying to get some concessions out of the Democrats. So Zelensky was scheduled to attend the briefing via a secure video conference call, but he canceled his appearance shortly before the meeting. I wonder why he canceled it. It didn't say why. But the discussion got so heated that at one point, Senators Tom Cotton and Kevin Cramer, both Republicans, were shouting questions at the senior Biden administration officials in the room, including Blinken, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, and the new Joint Chiefs Chairman Charles Q. Brown Jr., and basically just yelling about the border. So lots of infighting in the Senate going on here, and still struggling to pass all this Ukraine aid. But Schumer has scheduled a vote to advance Biden's huge $106 billion request for Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan. There's going to be some kind of vote on that on Wednesday, which he expects to fail. So we'll see what happens.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
You just saw the numbers come out today for job openings. They were terrible. Way down. And this is the Christmas season. October, they were starting, that's October numbers. They're down. And then each week in the Trends Journal, we show all the people that are getting laid off. Spotify, what did they just announce? They're firing almost 20% of their workforce. So this is big. So they're going to be lowering interest rates. We've been saying this now for the better part of a year, that they were going to begin lowering them in early 2024. Now the street is saying the same thing. First, they were saying, no, they're not going to start lowering them until May. Now they're up to March. They're going to lower interest rates in the run-up to the presidential reality show because they want to keep in power the people in power. As I keep saying over and over again, the former Fed head, Janet Yellen, is now our Treasury Secretary. So you really have to be fucking stupid not to see who's running the show. You mean the former Fed head is our Treasury Secretary? Yeah. So the banksters are in charge. And they want to stay in charge. Esmes Fatcha Brut. And oil prices are down. Why are oil prices down? Well, the oil prices are down for two reasons. Number one, America has just hit an all-time high of about 13 million gallons a day of production. But the other one, demand is going down. It's a supply and demand issue. And even though OPEC cut back on what they said they were going to put out into the market, the prices are still down. But all that could change with the Israel war ramping up. Because if Israel escalates it into Syria, Lebanon, and Iran, you're going to see oil prices go to $130 a barrel plus, and that's going to crash the economies and the equity markets. And the war machine keeps on pumping it out for more war. This is by this guy who's our Pentagon chief, this Lloyd Austin. Lloyd Austin, a former murderer in Iraq, that was such a brave guy, and how Americans slaughtered so many innocent people under his command. Yeah, that Lloyd Austin who loves war. And the media only promotes those who sell the war line. And that's why we're asking you also to please hit that button over there and, to have people subscribe to this channel, because I'm banned by the mainstream media, and so is everybody else talking about peace. And the way my message gets out to social media is through you. So please do what you can. Take a second to like this channel, and push those algorithms up because they're shadow banning us. So going back to this guy, Austin, who, by the way, his last job was sitting on the board of directors of Raytheon, the second largest defense contractor. And we have an article in this week's Trends Journal about that, as well as an article by Ron Paul. And that's the last person I voted for president. And there's a lot of great articles in the Trends Journal, of course. So here's what he said. He said, spending on the production of artillery shells by the Pentagon has almost doubled in recent years and will be increased even further. Quote, Ukraine's high burn rate for artillery has hammered home the need to invest even more in munitions. Invest more in munitions to keep killing and slaughtering people. Hey, Austin boy, I launched Occupy Peace. I am a true American patriot. You are not. You are a despicable person of hatred of our founding fathers like George Washington, a real man that fought, who warns us not to get involved in foreign entanglements. But you want more of them. He goes on, compared to the defense budget from 5 years ago, we're putting nearly 50% more money into munitions. And during this administration, America's production of artillery shells won't just increase, it won't just double, it will quadruple. Yay! Yay! As America sends more weapons to keep slaughtering innocent Palestinians. Oh, yeah, we're getting Hamas. Yeah, over 100,000 buildings have been destroyed. What are you talking about? And again, look at the links in your Trends Journal. We're showing these pictures of apartment after apartment being blown away. Oh, yeah, we're getting Hamas. That's a lot of bullshit. How about people like George Washington? How about people like Dwight D. Eisenhower, who warned the American people not to get involved in these foreign entanglements? And I'm telling you, they're going to ramp up these Ukraine war, and they're going to ramp up the Israel war. They're doing it already, and they're going to get the people to support it. Because here's what they're saying. EU warns of Christmas terror attacks. The European Union faces a huge risk of terrorist attacks over the Christmas holiday period in a society increasingly polarized by the Israel-Hamas war, the bloc's Home Affairs Commissioner said today. FBI Director Christopher Wade warned today that terror threats in America are at an all-time high following the October 7th attack in Israel. Okay? You see what they're doing? They're going to have a false flag event, as I've been warning. Whether it's Ukraine doing it, something big's going to happen, and everybody's going to support the Lloyd Austin.
The Peter Schiff Show.
Case is Moore versus the United States, and it's probably the most significant Supreme Court case, maybe in my lifetime. And if you read the way the media is framing it, somehow they're saying that, well, if the plaintiffs prevail on this, that it's really bad because it's going to cost the U.S. government billions or trillions in lost tax revenue. But what's really at stake is our own freedom, or what's left of it, and our own liberty. And if the plaintiffs lose, there goes the rest of our liberty, because we're potentially basically opening up a Pandora's box of oppressive taxation in our future. If you're an American citizen, you are rooting for the plaintiffs to win. We want the U.S. government to have to do without those trillions of dollars of unconstitutional tax revenue. So if the government wants to replace that lost revenue, let them come up with a constitutional tax structure to do it. We can't uphold an unconstitutional tax simply because it means the government is going to lose money, because that's the purpose of the Constitution, to prevent the government from raising money precisely the way they're trying to do it. Now, what this case is about is the Moores were hit by the deemed repatriation tax, which was actually passed by President Trump as part of the Jobs Act. And what it said is that if you're an American citizen and you have an interest in an overseas company, that the law is going to tax you on all of the income that overseas company had earned going backwards in time for, I forget, 10 years or more, whatever it was, and you have to pay a tax right now. We're gonna deem that you actually earned all that money, even though you've never seen it, you've never touched it, you have no access to it, and you may never get it, right? Because they're a minority shareholder in a foreign company. Now, that foreign company is paying whatever foreign taxes it owes, right? So the money has been taxed at the corporate level in whatever jurisdiction it's domiciled. But because the Moores had, I don't know, 10% of it, whatever, some small percentage, they never saw any distributions. I mean, and they've never sold their stock. So they haven't received any income, right, in the sense of the word from the 16th Amendment, because they own an interest. But now they got hit with a tax bill. I think it was $15,000. So they went to the court and they said, hey, this is unconstitutional. This is not income. I never got any benefit from this. You just can't tax this and claim it's income. And they're correct. But they lost, and they lost in the appellate court, but they appealed, and the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case. Now, the Founding Fathers didn't like direct taxes. They liked excise taxes because they said they're self-correcting as to abuse, meaning that if they raise the tax too much, you don't buy the product. But direct taxes are by their nature oppressive because you can't avoid them. They're just taxing you directly. The only reason the government was even given the power to levy a direct tax was for war. And in fact, that's what the framers thought. They thought that direct taxes would be reserved for a war. Well, now we don't even bother. We just print money and create inflation to pay for wars. But what's at stake here is the government now is trying to say that this tax is okay, that it's not a direct tax on property, because the argument that the Moores have made, and they're correct, or their attorneys are correct, is what is being taxed here under the guise of income is property. The government is taxing the Moores because they own stock in a foreign company. They don't have any income because they haven't gotten a dividend and they haven't sold. And the government is trying to deem that income. They're trying to pretend that it's income so they can tax it without apportionment. And they can't do that. In fact, I put in my book, The Real Crash, America's Coming Bankruptcy, a quote from Eisner versus McConver, which is being discussed and was discussed today in oral argument. And this is what the court wrote in Eisner. Congress cannot, by any definition it may adopt, conclude the matter, since it cannot by legislation alter the Constitution. And what they meant by the matter was, what is the definition of income? And the court said it's not up to Congress. They can't define income however they want, because then they can change the Constitution. You have to have a legal definition of income because that's what Congress can tax. It says they can tax income. So they can't define income. And if you look at all the Supreme Court cases, income is the gain derived from labor or capital or the combination thereof. It is a gain derived. How do you derive a gain? You realize that gain, right? You get money, right, from your activity. You earned money. Now, what the government is arguing is that you don't have to actually realize a gain to have income. The government is claiming that anything that makes you richer. They're saying that income should be defined as any increase in the value of something or your wealth between two arbitrary points in time. So the government can say, hey, between 2010 and 2020, if some asset that you owned went up in value during those 10 years, well, that's income. And now we're going to levy a tax on it, right? This is a huge change in American tax law to try to say that the government can just define any appreciation as income when it can't. And they're really talking about the concept of realization. The plaintiffs are arguing that income has to be realized before it can be taxed, which is true. You have to realize a gain before you have a gain. And if you don't realize the gain, you may never get it. I mean, how many times have you owned a stock that went way up and you didn't sell it, and then it went way down, and by the time you sold it, you actually lost money? The fact that at one moment in time you could have had a gain if you chose to realize it is irrelevant to the fact that that gain is gone and you don't have it. But the government wants to be able to tax it.
Guy named Algernon Sidney, who was considered a patriot and a martyr to liberty, a martyr for liberty to the American revolutionaries. Now, he was regarded, again, as a hero to liberty, a martyr, and he was very much influential on the revolution. Thomas Jefferson talked about how he was part of the influence for the text in the Declaration of Independence. Here from a letter to Henry Lee in 1825, he pointed out that the object of the Declaration of Independence was not to find out new principles or new arguments never before thought of, not merely to say things which had never been said before, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject. It was, he said, intended to be an expression of the American mind, and to give to that expression the proper tone and spirit called for by the occasion. And what was the influence on that American mind? Jefferson put it this way: all its authority rests then on the harmonizing sentiments of the day, whether expressed in conversations and letters, printed essays, or in the elementary books of public right, such as Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, Sidney, etc. So he was then pointing out that Sidney was part of the influence on the Declaration of Independence, someone that no one has really ever heard of. I mean, outside of those of us here, very few people have heard this name. Hear from John Adams talking about the right of rebellion, because, of course, that's what was going to happen. But this is in February of 1775. He said, "We are not exciting a rebellion." And I covered it in a previous episode, but you can find it in Algernon Sidney's book. He talks about how, well, this is not a rebellion at all if you are standing up against what government isn't authorized to do. And John Adams is really drawing on Algernon Sidney, which I'll get to in a moment. "We are not exciting a rebellion," he writes. "Opposition, nay, open, avowed resistance by arms against usurpation and lawless violence is not rebellion by the law of God or the land." As I mentioned in another episode this week, it's government that's in open rebellion when government refuses to follow the rules given to it. And then if the people choose not to put down that rebellion, then it's on the people. John Adams continued. Now, this is back when Adams was one of the good guys, before he went super monarchist and loved the Alien and Sedition Acts and stuff like that. Atlas of Independence put it this way: resistance to lawful authority makes rebellion. Hampden, Russell, Sidney, Summers, Holt, Tillotson, Burnet, Hoadley, etc. were no tyrants nor rebels, although some of them were in arms, and the others undoubtedly excited resistance against the Tories. So to have resistance to unlawful authority, as Benjamin Franklin put it, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. Here's Algernon Sidney. He said, "I will not take upon me," and he talks about the three times that he thinks, the three primary times when it's morally acceptable to do this type of thing. He said, "I will not take upon me to enumerate all the cases in which this may be done, but content myself with three, which have most frequently given occasions for proceedings of this kind." And you can see here, as we get through this a little bit more, how this was such an influence on the Declaration of Independence and the separation from the British. He said, "The first is when one or more men take upon them the power and name of a magistracy to which they are not justly called." So someone being in a position of power, they're not even authorized to be there. A usurper to the throne, for example. The second, when one or more being justly called, continue in their role, their magistracy, longer than the laws by which they are called to prescribe. And then the third, which I think is most applicable, when he or they who are rightly called do assume a power, though within the time prescribed, that the law does not give. So when they do stuff that they are not authorized to do. He said, or turn that which the law does give to an end different and contrary to that which is intended by it. And I think that probably covers somewhere around 99.9999999% of all the federal so-called acts, laws, rules, regulations, orders, and mandates that are on the books today. FNEN.org. He put it this way: to retain its liberty, a society must be composed of people who are willing to question the authority of superiors. I mean, if you think about it in application today, how many people in recent years got even worse when it came to just deferring to the experts in government? And then the government, of course, loves this stuff, because when government has people just looking to them to do whatever will make them no longer afraid of whatever they're afraid from, government's going to do all kinds of nasty stuff. We're already talking about the largest government in history, and they are just salivating to keep growing. But so you have to have a people who are willing to question this idea of authority. Here's how Sidney put it: who will wear a shoe that hurts him just because the shoemaker tells him 'tis well made? So he's saying, well, just because these government people tell us stuff, we don't have to necessarily believe them. And I think that's a mentality that we need so much more of today. He goes further. He said, such as have reason, understanding, or common sense will and ought to make use of it in those things that concern themselves and their posterity, and suspect the words of such as are interested in deceiving or persuading them not to see with their own eyes, that they may be more easily deceived. TLDR, the short version is, Sidney is saying, don't trust people with power. And you may have heard me say in the past, I cite people like John Adams talking about power, Abigail, and so many others, talking about you can't trust. John Adams may have summed it up best. Don't trust anyone with power to endanger the public liberty. And I would just add the caveat that also includes the people who tell you don't trust anyone with power, because power is a very corrupting influence. And that's really what this is what Sidney is getting to here. And it's very important, especially at the time. If you think of the time, the king did not like that type of mentality. Again, he didn't publish this. They just found it in his home. He said, we cannot distinguish truth from falsehood, right from wrong, or know what obedience we owe to the magistrate, or what we may justly expect from him, unless we know what he is, why he is, and by whom he is made to be what he is. These perhaps may be called mysteries of state. I thought that was just an interesting add to include there as well. Just short version, you just cannot trust people with power.
This is a poll that the mainstream media doesn't want Americans to see. Certainly the right-wing media doesn't want Americans to see. And put this one up if you can. This is from antiwar.com. Majority of American voters want U.S. to call for permanent Gaza ceasefire. And I think some of the things that are happening, well, first of all, I have to say social media has changed this, specifically Twitter. Because since Elon Musk has come in and has opened it up for a real debate, you have a lot of citizen journalists, you have a lot of fact checkers, you have a lot of people like Max Blumenthal, for example, who has really dug into what happened on October 7th and found some interesting things about it. And you're having people who are debunking propaganda in real time. These are significant things. And so while the mainstream media still has a hold on the majority of American people, more and more people are looking for alternatives. They're looking at things that we look at, like Zero Hedge and Antiwar.com and other. Now, this is where Biden is in trouble. It includes 76% of Democrats. And this is surprising because you wouldn't see this. 49% of Republicans. Okay, so it's not a majority of Republicans, but you're factoring all the neocons, all of the Uber hawks and this. When you even factor all these people in, you're almost at 50-50, people saying we don't want any part of this. And I think one of the things that is behind this, Dr. Paul, is the realization, and more people are seeing this, that this is America's war. We are supplying the bombs, we're supplying the weapons, we're supplying the drones, we're supplying the intelligence, we're supplying the targeting. This is just like Ukraine, this is America's proxy war to a degree. Now, it's not an even fit, but our proxy war in the Middle East. We own this war, and I think a lot of Americans are saying, no thanks.
But what our leaders have become dependent on is that this was different because we're going to avoid the body bags. And Vietnam and other things, they would have tried to hide them, which they couldn't get away with. But now they have devised this system where it's our money and all the things that you list, all the responsibility. So we're into this big time, but still the people, didn't see body bags, and they're told, well, the American soldiers aren't dying. And even Israelis will say, we don't have to have the American troops. We just want your money and your weapons and take care of it. So that to me means that this is a good news story in the fact that people woke up absent the gory details of what happened in Vietnam, where they started reporting, what was happening. And you point out back then it was the television and things that were coming through, but now we have something faster than the news on television. We have the internet, and that makes a difference. And we get the news. We have I think everybody should recognize you have a bigger job in sorting out what you should believe and what you shouldn't believe, because sometimes the rapidity that we have on the internet will give you a disastrous group of people coming along to believe in, like in COVID. They were successfully in undermining, truth. And but this is good. And I think that the American people, out of their own self-interest, and it has to be out of their own self-interest, that they have to look at this as, what does this mean? What does this mean? And I keep emphasizing the economics, because that's the one that comes home. And if we can, I would just hit that so hard if I'd happen to be into politics, is showing why foreign policy is the bread and butter issue at home. Johnson tried to say, you can have bread and butter, we're so rich, and he didn't get away with it. That gave us the 1970s, and that was a disastrous decade. So we're still trying to do that, except one thing. The financial situation of this country is much worse than it was in the 60s and the 70s, and those were bad decades. Well, so there's something that should bring it all together, and that is just the right to live freely in a free country and not always be paying for wars and all this thing that goes on. And that I think is starting to show through. They realize that there is a limit to what we have to put up with. So I think some of this stuff is good, and people are realizing it. But the whole thing is understanding how the problem started, what the solution is, where is the pain going to go, because you just can't liquidate these trillions and trillions of dollars. I talk about trillions going up in 1 year. It's not over 3 decades or something, or 100 years before you can get $1 trillion. But now it's just totally exploding, and that's why people are so worried about what's happening.
Yeah, rightly so.
We tried our best to change things immediately, but also to leave a record, of what could be and should have been done. And it wasn't what got to make people, well, how did you know this and this? I said, well, it's really not complicated. Violence is not good. The Constitution gives us good guidelines, and if we act in a moral sense, we don't dig these holes.
Clip of Congressman Massey on with Tucker, and he talks about Ukraine here. And let's watch this exchange as we kind of close out, lean toward the edge of today's show. This is such a great exchange. Let's listen to this.
We've spent twice as much in Ukraine as we do on all of our roads and bridges federally in the United States. That is money that could have gone to double our infrastructure. Yet we're blowing up infrastructure that we're going to end up, I hate this, but they're going to tell us that we have to rebuild it when this is all over with.
The scale of this insanity is hard to digest, and they're saying we have a moral obligation. You're a bad person. You just heard the National Security Advisor say that you're a bad person if you're against this. But no one ever mentions that we have abetted the killing of an entire generation of Ukrainian men that will not be replaced to fight a war that they cannot win. They literally cannot win. We prevented a peace deal, and we extended the war, and we killed all these people. And so all the ones running around with their little Ukraine flag pins, they're implicated in that. Has anyone apologized?
No, to support this money, you have to be economically illiterate and morally deficient. Those are both conditions of voting for this. Because to say that we're going to grind down Russia, that we're going to deplete their own soldiers by expending the lives of Ukrainians, knowing that in the end, we're going to leave them holding the bag, that in the end, they can never prevail. They're not going to take back Crimea, even though
I could sit and watch this for a long time. He makes a couple great points. One of them is familiar. We blow up their stuff, then we have to pay to fix it.
They're already lining up.
And the other, which is interesting, is the money we sent over the last year is more than we spend on the entire roads and bridges in the U.S.
Yeah, they're all falling down.
Yeah.
We didn't even have to bomb them. They're just worn out.
Yeah, exactly. So hats off to Thomas and Massey.
So sad.
Yeah.
What is your political obligation then, according to Plato? As a citizen, what is your obligation? To recognize your identity with all other men and act accordingly. And what is the arch vice you can embody? To treat yourself as an autonomous, self-sufficient entity living for your own happiness. You must live for the welfare of the state as a whole. Now again, I point out, as a Greek, Plato is not exclusively an altruist. He did say that you can legitimately be concerned with your own happiness also on the side, in effect. And he did say that in his state, that will not only produce the collective happiness, but also your individual happiness. But those are concessions to the prevailing Greek viewpoint and not characteristic of Plato. Qua Platonist as against qua Greek, Plato is an active, ardent state worshipper, an advocate of the view that individuals should live to serve the state and should systematically sacrifice themselves in their personal happiness. I quote, "Excessive love of self is the greatest of all evils," unquote. What is the ideal? Well, I'm quoting now from his very last dialogue, The Laws. The ideal is, quote, "that the private and individual be altogether banished from life, and that things which are by nature private, such as eyes and ears and hands, become common," unquote. What is Plato's attitude toward private property, private concerns? The kind of person who will say, "This is mine, that is thine, yours." The kind of person who's so concerned to establish ownership. Who owns this? Whose is it? Quote from the Republic. "Disunion comes about when the words mine and not mine, another's and not another's, are not applied to the same things throughout the community. The best ordered state will be the one in which the largest number of persons use these terms in the same sense, and which accordingly most nearly resembles a single person. When one of us hurts his finger, the whole extent of those bodily connections, which are gathered up in the soul and unified, is made aware, and it all shares as a whole in the pain of the suffering part. And hence we say that not only the finger, but the man has a pain. The same thing is true of the pain or pleasure felt when any other part of the person suffers or is relieved." Yes, says the other speaker in this dialogue, "I agree that the best organized community comes nearest to that condition. In our community then, above all others, when things go well or ill with any individual, everyone will use that word mine in the same sense and say that all is going well or ill with him and his. People will not rend the community asunder by each applying that word mine to different things and dragging off whatever he can get for himself into a private home, where he will have his separate family forming a center of exclusive joys and sorrows. Rather, people will all, so far as may be, feel together and aim at the same ends," unquote. Now that, of course, is a formal and explicit advocacy of the exact view of man and of society that Ayn Rand dramatizes in Anthem. And that is therefore hardly an extreme projection, that is a dramatization of Plato's political ideal. And not only Plato's, of course, all collectivists thereafter. The ideal is for men to form one unit with all goods in common. And in this respect, Plato is the father of communism. And it is instructive to observe that he is the father of Western religion and the father of Western communism. And that both of those are beautifully integrated in his philosophy to form one coherent whole. A very helpful thought when you observe that the two branches of descendants today pose as warring antagonists.
Senate Republicans blocked a motion to advance a massive $111 billion spending package that includes military aid for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. And they did this over a partisan dispute on border issues. They're still negotiating with the Democrats, and they said they would block this bill, and they did. So this effort failed in a vote of 49 to 51, with every Republican voting against the measure. Senator Bernie Sanders, who's an independent, technically, he does generally vote with Democrats, but he also voted no, and he did so due to his opposition to providing Israel with more unconditional military aid, as Israel is killing civilians on a massive scale in Gaza. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, he switched his vote to no when he realized that the bill was going to fail, and he had to do that in order to be able to bring it for a vote in the future. And this needed 60 votes to pass, and so it failed. It didn't come close to that. And President Biden initially requested $106 billion, and the Senate Democrats added another $5 billion to that because, why not throw a few more billion in there? The legislation now includes $67 billion to spend on Ukraine. That includes military and economic aid, and I believe some humanitarian assistance is in there. And the purpose of this is to fuel the war for a whole nother year and prop up the Ukrainian government, even as there's all these clear signs that Ukrainian forces don't have a chance of breaking through. They just want to keep this war going. That's literally the purpose, just to keep it going, not for a Ukrainian victory, because they know that's not going to happen. They just want people to keep fighting and dying. So the $111 billion also includes billions to beef up security at the border, but Republicans are looking to change laws, asylum laws and things like that, to make it harder for migrants to get in. And doesn't seem like they're close to any deal. I'm not really sure of the behind the scenes stuff, but Schumer called this vote and they expected it to fail, and it did fail. So it's not clear what the next step is here. Unfortunately, I do think this is ultimately going to pass at some point, because these Republicans are blocking this for something kind of unrelated. And Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said Wednesday that Hezbollah must be pushed back from the Israeli border, and if it's not achieved through diplomatic means, Israel will take military action. So the comments suggest Israel is considering opening a second front in Lebanon beyond the cross-border strikes Israel and Hezbollah have been exchanging since October 7th. According to a recent report from Axios, some U.S. officials are concerned that Israel might provoke Hezbollah to justify a wider war in Lebanon. The report said that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin had expressed concern in a phone call with Gallant in November about the risk of escalation on Israel's northern border. So it's important to keep in mind that U.S. officials are worried that it's Israel that's going to provoke a bigger war, a war in Lebanon. Gallant made the comments on Wednesday while visiting the northern coastal city of Nar Aria. He said the Israeli government would not encourage the approximately 80,000 civilians who evacuated areas of northern Israel to return to their homes until Hezbollah is pushed back beyond the Litani River, which is 18 miles north of the Israel-Lebanon border in southern Lebanon. So at the end of the 2006 Israel-Lebanon war, UN Security Council Resolution 1701 established a demilitarized zone between the border and the Litani River, and that required Israeli forces to withdraw from southern Lebanon and Hezbollah to move north of the river. According to the Times of Israel, Gallant said that the best option would be to reach a diplomatic solution to agree on the enforcement of Resolution 1701, and that if that didn't happen, he said Israel would act with all the means at its disposal to push Hezbollah back through military action. And last month, Gallant made some pretty threatening comments toward the country of Lebanon, not just Hezbollah. He said that Israel could turn Beirut into Gaza. He said, quote, Hezbollah is dragging Lebanon to a possible war and making mistakes. What we can do in Gaza, we can also do in Beirut. The U.S. announces a $175 million weapons package for Ukraine. So the Biden administration on Wednesday announced this new weapons package as President Biden pleaded with Congress to authorize more spending on the proxy war. So I mentioned this in an earlier article about the Senate blocking that bill, but I'll read another quote here from Biden about this. This was his little plea that he made on TV. He said, quote, "This cannot wait. Congress needs to pass supplemental funding for Ukraine before they break for the holiday recess. Simple as that. Frankly, I think it's stunning that we've gotten to this point in the first place. Republicans in Congress are willing to give Putin the greatest gift he can hope for and abandon our global leadership," end quote. So this weapons package, it includes AIM-9 and AIM-7 missiles for air defense, HIMARS ammunition, artillery rounds, high-speed anti-radiation missiles, TOW missiles, Javelin anti-tank missiles, more than 4 million rounds of small arms ammunition, vehicles to tow and haul equipment, demolition munitions, equipment to protect infrastructure, that's very vague, and then spare parts maintenance and all that. So they still have the money, what they call the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which lets the U.S. ship weapons directly from Pentagon stockpiles. By my count, they still have like over $4 billion left from the $6 billion that became available thanks to a Pentagon accounting error that they said they overvalued previous arms shipments, so it freed up all this money. And that's all they have left of what was authorized by Congress so far. So that's what they're using for this latest weapons package.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
The debacle of the nearly 20-year American occupation of Afghanistan continues in Joe Biden's America today. The disaster began when President George W. Bush, stung deeply by the intelligence that he failed to heed, thus enabling the attacks of 9/11 to take place unimpeded, convinced the American people in Congress and most of our allies that the bad guys who ran Afghanistan in the early part of the century needed to be taught a lesson, whether they personally enabled or facilitated the 9/11 attacks or not. And you go on to say more about George Bush. And again, 88% of the people believe this little clown boy. We're going to get that guy Osama bin Laden, dead or alive. That's a quote.
Yeah. Well, the reason I wrote the article is because the $2 trillion spent on Afghanistan, the 20-year occupation, the 850,000 deaths resulted in the same mindset occupying and taking over Afghanistan after American troops left as we tried to kick out. It was as if American hubris was blind to the efforts by British troops in the 19th century, about 20,000, and 100,000 Soviet troop deaths in the 20th century, both in efforts to bend the Afghan culture to their will, the British to the West, the Russians to their will. So under the guise of spreading democracy, an impossible task, Bush invaded. The invasion was not grounded on a declaration of war. We had no ability to declare war on the country of Afghanistan because that country's government did not invade us. Instead, the Congress and the Bush-Cheney regime came up with a novel idea, a monstrosity utterly unknown to the Constitution, called an AUMF, an authorization for use of military force. It doesn't name a target. It doesn't name an entity. It has no end. It can be used anytime you want. So Bush's successors have used it to kill people who were infants at the time it was enacted. It purports to authorize the American president to kill anybody he wants that arguably had anything to do with 9/11, even if they were babies at the time of 9/11. That monstrosity manifests the mindset of American hubris, that we are the essential country, Joe Biden's phrase, that we can spread our Americanism wherever we want to go. Before we started this show this morning, you read something to me I hadn't heard, which is a quote from Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, which mimics this very theme and condemns people like you and I and the hundreds of thousands listening to us now who want peace.
And so what you're saying about what's going on, and people also, again, we wrote about this judge in detail in the Trends Journal. Afghans said, listen, let's talk about this. We had nothing to do with it. Bush's words were, there are no time to talk. And they were saying that the reason we were invading Afghanistan was because Osama bin Laden was hiding there and they were protecting him.
That's about as realistic as Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, and therefore we must invade Iraq. This is the reason that Bush and Cheney are guilty of war crimes for killing human beings under false pretenses and dragging the United States into wars under false pretenses.
How come the Pope isn't saying, I want all you Catholic people to stand up and protest at what's going on in Gaza as they're slaughtering people in front of everybody's eyes?
Right.
Nearly 17,000 people killed.
Well, more civilians killed in Gaza in 8 weeks than killed in Ukraine in 18 months, because the Israeli government, the Netanyahu regime, is engaged in an act of genocide, and Putin is engaged in a serious military endeavor to stop the Nazis from bombing the Russian cultural people in eastern Ukraine. And of course, the United States somehow still supports Ukraine. The Congress will debate this week or next $68 billion that old Joe wants to give to Ukraine. Even Lindsey Graham, who never met somebody else's blood that he didn't want to shed, is having misgivings about it. Oh, and let's not forget another $13 billion to the Israelis. We've given them so far 15,000 bombs and 57,000 artillery shells, and basically said, oh, here they are, but don't use them, which is absurd. Absurd. Tony Blinken has no credibility whatsoever. Joe Biden has no credibility whatsoever.
Tell the people, what is Defend the Guard first?
So Defend the Guard is simple legislation that says that without a formal declaration of war from Congress, as prescribed in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, right, that the states will prohibit their National Guard from deploying into overseas active combat.
Now tell us, on the primary ballot, what do you mean? It just means it'll be a referendum statewide that happens to coincide with the primary elections instead of the
the primary. So if you're voting Republican in Texas, which is a good chunk of Texas, you will have this on your ballot.
And so, well, I guess I'm confused then. So it ain't for a law; it's for inside the Republican Party to.
It's a ballot proposition, and essentially what this tells the lawmakers is, let's say 85%, 90% say they support this. This tells the lawmakers, hey, 90% of your constituents want Defend the Guard passed.
I see. So this is a referendum inside the Republican Party of Texas.
Correct.
I see. And so what's your strength look like there? What do you think?
Well, the good part is that some of the weakest ballot propositions that have come forward still get about 75%. So
this is not a weak one. This is a big deal to everyone.
This is a big deal. And here's the thing: I was at the convention, so you know we were moving this, and I was talking to the folks of it's like the state Republican executive committee, which is like the SREC, and this is where resolutions, ballot propositions, all of this stuff, the Republican Party comes together to get all this stuff squared away. As I'm explaining this, everybody, it just made sense to them, and the easiest part was like, why can't we focus on our border rather than Ukraine's? And that everybody, like, they threw up their hands and yelled hallelujah.
Wait, not everybody knows everything in there, but these are some of the most basic things. Torture is banned, right? And presidential wars are banned by the U.S. Constitution. And so all you're doing is saying, I just came home from the wars, and I think we need to start obeying the law now. I don't know, Diego. That seems fair to me.
I don't even think it's knowledge of the Constitution. Like, some people that don't even understand, and it's not a knock, but like, Dan was on Jimmy Dore show, and he started talking about the 10th Amendment, and Jimmy Dore's like, what's that? So it's not even knowledge of the Constitution that would make you go, yeah, rah, rah, rah. And I love Jimmy, that's not a knock, but you don't even have to pretend to know the Constitution to be like, this makes sense. I don't care what it is, I want this. And the fact that it's going to be before the Republican voters come here in Texas, which is a deep red state, I predict that this is going to do really well.
And I do too. Okay, so listen, you mentioned the Horton Rule. I didn't name it that. Michael Bolden named it that. This just comes from all my experience driving a cab, because I'm a libertarian, and I met every single person in the world before. Okay, that was my job. And so what I figured out, and it's a pretty obvious truth, but maybe people just never thought of this before, is everybody's good on something. So if you're a libertarian and therefore good on everything, then you can find where people are good on something, agree with that, nail that down, and then extrapolate from there. That actually freedom is the answer to all of these questions, isn't it? And so we can be better than the left on the things that the left is good on, and we can be better than the right on the things that the right is good on, without being more left-wing or more right-wing than them. Just be ourselves. And and we're the defenders of all things good, and the opposers of all things aggressive and evil, and which distort our wonderful free market economy that we're supposed to have. And so that's the ticket here. That's what's happening here. Is Dan McKnight, Diego Rivera. These guys came home from George Bush's wars and Barack Obama's wars and said, okay, we're going to stand for the Constitution. And unlike the kind of mythology of the Vietnam War era, everybody's seen the Oliver Stone movie, Born on the 4th of July, where the idea is you come home from the war and then become a dirty, stinking, commie, hippie, drug abuser and oppose the war. Well, thanks a lot, Oliver Stone, but that's actually not really the best message to send. In fact, how about you got all these guys who came home from the war and they didn't move left at all? Diego Rivera and Dan McKnight and their team, these guys haven't moved left. They're libertarians and conservatives, Constitution guys, Republican Party guys, always have been. And they're the ones leading this. So that is my preface to my call to all the anti-war veterans in this audience, especially in Texas, but around this country too. that, listen, man, this is something that you guys can get involved in with a bunch of really great guys who are already on your team. You know what I mean? It's something that where you can really help move the needle in a way that is in any given state where this passes, you're saving a guy's life, right? The rubber meets the road there. But on top of that, this is an earthquake in American society. The conservatives and constitutionalists and libertarians are using the Republican Party to introduce this anti-war legislation invoking George Washington's Constitution and the law of who is responsible for sending these guys to war and whether we're going to obey the law or let our government run riot around the world the way that they have. And when, by the way, we haven't won a war since 1945. So, you know what I mean? It's this, to me, I'd almost go back in time and join the Army just so I could say that I'm with you guys on this. I can only just cheer for you and celebrate what you guys are doing and beseech anti-war veterans in the audience to join with Bring Our Troops Home and Defend the Guard, both .us.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
The Biden-Blinken rules of war. Oh, this was just, all right, we'll read this one paragraph. Mr. Blinken understands that Israel has more to do to defeat Hamas. Hamas cannot remain in control of Gaza. So there you go. They're getting rid of Hamas. What are they going to do once Hamas is gone? Who's going to run the territory? What are they going to do with all the residents of Gaza? What's the plan for all this? They're not talking about any of that. But the current people running it, we all understand they have to go, right? He reiterated a press conference in Israel Thursday. Israel campaign has so far secured most of the northern half. I don't know what else was in that paragraph. All right, here's the other paragraph. Paragraph 1-3. The best way to save civilians is to get them from far from urban combat zones. Now, I think this is like one of the most densely populated places, and we've already displaced 80% of the people. So the entire thing's an urban combat zone. But the safe thing we have to do is get these trapped people away from urban combat zones, away from Hamas strongholds like the city of Khan Yunis. But Mr. Blinken demands avoiding further significant displacement of civilians inside of Gaza. I don't know how much more you can displace if 80% of them are displaced. And I don't know if only 20% is left, you're past the significant part. But okay, instead he called on Israel to create safe zones. So in other words, like base. Listen, they reviewed it. They weren't sure how to treat the situation. And then someone proposed like a freeze tag type thing where we just need to have some bases. Like a while ago, I read on Zero Hedge, I think I said it here, there was this interesting thing about soldiers, un-American soldiers ending up being employed by our army. Because if you think about, like, I've often thought about, the argument for why it's important for American citizens to have guns and because it keeps the government in check. And I do believe that it does work that way because they can only get so tyrannical before they have to actually contend with the fact that there's an armed civilization. You go, yeah, but they've got an army. And then you start thinking, yeah, but does the army really want to go into Texas and fight Texans? Like the Texans would have what are they like? If it's something so horrible like slavery, I understand where you go. All right, I gotta go, or I guess preserving the union. I don't know. Let's not go into that rabbit hole. So I'm trying to make a different point here, and we don't have to ADD every single point. Sometimes we can have focus, a direct linear thought. For you to go and kill your fellow American citizen, I think you'd have to be paid quite handsomely to do so. And I would think you'd have to really be paying soldiers really, really well that they would take your side over the average citizens. Like if you're talking about an actual civil war against the government of people going, nope, we're not doing that. And they start rolling in the army with tanks. How many people are going to stand with the government as opposed to, your average citizens? Well, that dynamic can shift if instead of hiring American citizens for the U.S. Army, you start hiring, basically people that just came here. They might not have the same allegiances to their fellow American citizen as, somebody who's not actually from here. I think they were talking about, I forgot what their historical examples were of at the end of societies, essentially, hiring foreign militaries to do the dirty work because they would be more willing to, impose evil upon the citizens because they're not actually loyal to those people. So this, having heard that concept, and by the way, you can go down the Run Your Mouth archive. I read that article in a previous episode, but I saw this and I was like, holy shit.
What troubles me about the debate now about the southern border is it is one half of the immigration equation. Yes, we need order at the border. Yes, we need to have changes in the laws that reflect the reality of the overwhelming numbers from all over the world who are coming to our shores and our border. But there's also an incredible demand for legal immigration into this country even now. The presiding officer, my colleague from the state of Illinois, has legislation which addresses one aspect of that. Her bill, and I hope I describe it accurately, says that if you're an undocumented person in this country and you can pass the physical and the required test, background test, the like, you can serve in our military, and if you do it honorably, we will make you citizens of the United States. Do we need that? Do you know what the recruiting numbers are at the Army, in the Navy, in the Air Force? They can't reach their quotas each month. They can't find enough people to join our military forces.
I guess firstly, as a Democrat, who usually you guys don't like to contend with reality and you like to go, but this is so terrible. Look at the plight of these individuals. Isn't there something cruel about going, yeah, but if you're willing to fight and die for us and being enslaved in our military, then you can earn your freedom. So firstly, for the people that like to pretend like usually we don't live in reality and go, you gotta be nice to these people. This doesn't sound like it's that. And it sounds like it's right in line with what I was hearing of just wait till they recruit themselves an entire military force that's not actually American citizens. Lowers the cost of or the ability of the government and military to, basically turn tyrannical and turn this into a police state. And then Massey made a very interesting point on his interview with Tucker Carlson, where he goes, those COVID mandates also forced the best Americans out of the military, kind of cleansed the military of the free thinking patriots, the people who might have more of an outlook like you and I. Like, think about how many of probably the best soldiers left the military on account of COVID mandates. And now you're looking to replace them with people that migrated to the country illegally. All right.
Welcome to Liberty Lockdown. Please scan your barcode. Your liberty ain't gone, but yeah, it's on hold.
Well, I mean, this is what is so concerning, is that because of this process, it's very natural that you're going to have very illiberal policies to deal with it, which is also quite counter to the world I want to live in, to the nation I want to live in. So it's
probably what they want. They want the chaos so then they can implement more laws. They're probably causing this.
I completely agree. And that's actually where I'm going with this, is that what disturbs me about it is that the vast majority of people are totally oblivious to the fact that it's been both MI6 as well as the CIA, as well as Mossad, that has been funding much of the most radical elements of Islam in the Islamic world. Then they've had a bunch of unconstitutional, undeclared wars to go and destroy their nations, forcing these migration crises that then end up flooding both Europe as well as America. We're seeing another one today with Gaza, and I would imagine there will be 1 million or so Gazans that are supposed to flee somewhere because they're not going to be allowed to stay there, and it's going to end up being primarily Europe, but also the United States. And I don't think people are considering deeply enough what that means, both for us, domestically wherever we live, but also just how unbelievably stupid it is, so much so that it seems as if it can't be accidental. I mean, if you're going to destroy these nations, which unfortunately the U.S. government has been responsible for the vast majority of this, but the British have played their role dutifully alongside us oftentimes, but it has destroyed these people's homeland. So then, yeah, I don't even blame them for wanting to migrate elsewhere, because it's like if you have a drone flying over your head for 15 years in Afghanistan, I'd want to get out of there too. But then they go to these other nations, and then they want to reinstitute Sharia or whatever their preferred governance model is, and it's totally counter to the domestic population. And it just are people catching on to the fact that much of the radicalization that's happened in the Islamic world, or I assume some of your research has gone into this, are you privy to it?
I'm privy to, look, those unjust wars and those illegal invasions of those countries. Even America taking out Gaddafi, they knew they had to take out Gaddafi to open the floodgates of Europe, because it was Gaddafi that used to prevent them coming into Europe. Yeah,
right.
By taking out Gaddafi, they knew exactly what they were doing. And also, because it suited us when the Soviet were at war in Afghanistan, because it suited us against the Russians, we actually gave a base to all the radical jihadists in Britain. We allowed them. We funded ISIS. We've created most of them. Yeah. When I say we, again, they have. We haven't. Yeah? The same with Hamas, were created by Israel. The same. But that I try and differentiate those governing and in control who have made all these decisions with the people of the country. So
yeah, of course,
we're totally against it. I'd say most Jewish people in Israel are totally against what their government have done at times. Same with the American public, same with the British public. But they have orchestrated these wars for benefit, for money. I believe they want corporations to control the world. Few corporations governed by them, and to water down and break us down. It's like all these little conspiracy theorists, the attack on the family, yeah, the promotion of LGBTQ+, all these little things used to be individual things. It's like since COVID happened, they all just come together, yeah? It's like a jigsaw and all the pieces just fitted in, thinking you are attacking us from every angle.
Yeah.
And your purpose is to destroy and break down any resistance. So people, even like looking in our country, they've attacked our history, they've attacked our identity, because someone who doesn't know their history or understand their history ain't going to fight for it. They're not going to fight for who they are or their identity in their country. So they've purposely broke that down. They've purposely feminized us. But then the part is then you feminize the West, and then you bring in lots of masculine Muslims who are dominating the towns and cities, controlling the towns and cities. But then they all align together, like you're seeing now with the far left aligning with the Islamists, like we saw in Lebanon, like we saw in Iran. When the Islamists take over, they're the first people to get beheaded, the first people to get killed. But they're lying because they want to break down the system, they want to break down the rule of law, they want to destroy everything.
You personally have to pay a huge price. I mean, this constant legal battles, these legal fees, being thrown in jail, being pepper sprayed. I mean, what kind of toll has that taken on you?
at times. So I'm now 13, 14 years into activism. At times I've been in some very dark places, man. I went into jail one person and come out another. It wasn't so it's all this. So when I was in jail on the 2017 for reporting outside the case, I went to HMP Hull, which is a 5% Muslim population. I was fine. They then transferred me to the most densely populated Muslim population there is in the country, HMP only, with a 35% Muslim population, where they then used that excuse to put me on solitary confinement. Now, when they put me on solitary confinement, so I wasn't allowed out myself. I wasn't allowed to see anyone. I wasn't allowed to do anything. Just sitting in a room for 10 weeks. But it was what they done. So they knocked on my door one day, prison officers did, and they said, "Where's your wife?" How do I know where my wife is? Yeah? Like the only time, so because they had to lock down the whole jail to get me out of the cell for 30 minutes during the day, and they'd only do it during the day. Between when the whole jail was locked down for lunch, I was allowed out to walk around on my own, for 30 minutes. That was my exercise for 30 minutes. So I couldn't speak to my wife, or my kids, because they were at school. My wife worked at a school. They go and said, "Where's your wife?" I said, "I don't know." And they said, "Well, there's intelligence she's going to be attacked with acid." And I said, and then they just shut the door. And I'm like,
my God.
It was a weekend before I could ring her. And they've gone to my mum's house. They've done the same. They've gone to my mum's house. They've gone to my wife's house. And this is where Americans, we can only dream of having a constitution. You have free speech. You now have no idea. We live in a post-free speech era. It's gone. It's a facade in Europe. It's not there. It's never been there. It's just, you try using it, you see what happens.
It's quite clear to me that we are facing, and you earlier you were saying how you wish you could have a constitution. You wish you could have free speech. Like ours is very much in jeopardy. I'll grant you, it is much worse where you're at. But yeah, exactly. Where we are, as you said, we ought to be looking to that sphere of the world to understand what our imminent future is. And
person to say we need a reasonable peace deal in Ukraine. Now a lot of the neocons are quietly coming along to that position, with the exceptions of Nikki Haley and Joe Biden, who still support this, what I believe is pointless war in Ukraine. And I think those with foreign policy experience, one thing that Joe Biden and Nikki Haley have in common is that neither of them could even state for you 3 provinces in eastern Ukraine that they want to send our troops to actually fight for. Look at that. This is what I want people to understand. These people have, she has no idea what the hell the names of those provinces are, but she wants to send our sons and daughters and our troops and our military equipment to go fight it. So reject this myth that they've been selling you, that somebody had a cup of coffee stint at the UN and then makes $8 million after, has real foreign policy experience. It takes an outsider to see this through. Look at the blank expression. She doesn't know the names of the provinces that she wants to actually fight for. And there's a puppet.
That was brilliant. Look at her blank expression. She doesn't even know the provinces where she wants us to fight in. That's a moment. It's astonishing for me to hear people saying that she's surging, that she has this big base of support. Literally nobody likes her because she is not that smart. Let's put it that way, charitably. Remember last time her big thing was, you can't go on social media unless you use your real name. And then everyone pointed out, Nikki, you're not using your own real name. This is a fake name. You made it up. So, but this is a good one. Now, this is Nikki Haley at her finest. She's furious with TikTok. She's furious, and you'll never guess why. Let's put this next clip on and listen why she's so mad at TikTok.
We really do need to ban TikTok once and for all. And let me tell you why. For every 30 minutes that someone watches TikTok, every day, they become 17% more anti-Semitic, more pro-Hamas.
So,
anti-Semitic.
For every, this is amazing. For every 30 minutes you watch TikTok, you become 17% more anti-Semitic. And she figured that out somehow. I have to say, I don't want to put him on the spot, but our Intrepid Friday host had a comment on this, and I think it's a good question. Chris Rossini said, so after a few hours, you're 100% anti-Semitic? And then he asked a good question. Can you go over 100% if you keep watching after that?
I've worried about a new technology coming in, and she uses it, and that's this artificial intelligence. It's so artificial, and they put it together. There's no common sense. Artificial intelligence means it comes out of a machine and not out of a brain.
Yeah, I don't know. Let's listen to Marjorie Taylor Greene for about a minute and a half, because she's put on the conference committee, which means you should have a say. And so this is a good little bit. Really for Americans, this is a good little bit of behind the scenes of how things really work in D.C. Let's listen to Marjorie Taylor Greene.
I have been assigned. The NDAA is complete. I have been assigned to be a conferee on the conference. Here, we're going to follow me. We're getting an elevator. And we didn't get to participate at all. As a matter of fact, the whole NDAA deal was made between Speaker Johnson, Chuck Schumer, and the House Committee. And people like me, we didn't get to participate. And we were appointed to participate, to make sure no money for abortion, no money for trans, for members like me standing up for Americans who are sick and tired of funding the Ukraine war. We had taken the $300 million out of the defense bill. Well, let me tell you what the final product is and the deal that was made. So the policy is in place, that funding is there for abortion travel. The policy is still in place for trans and the military and everything that goes with it. Democrat trans policy, Democrat abortion policy. $300 million for Ukraine is back in the NDA, even though I had worked hard to take it out, it's back in. And furthermore, here's the worst news. It gets a clean FISA extension through April. No change to the FISA court whatsoever. Nothing changed, and that deal was made also. So just wanted to give you a heads up. I'll be flat out no to this NDAA, and I think it's outrageous that this happened with our Republican-controlled Congress.
That's great.
Isn't that so blatant?
Yeah.
To bring that up, and they should suspect the people getting annoyed with this kind of stuff. But here it is, 3,000 pages, and they start by saying nobody's going to read it. She was on a committee.
Yeah, on the committee.
And she's the one that's supposed to help bring it together, but they had to get rid of her somehow or another, so they just exclude everybody from doing it. But they are so blatant. But that's essentially when it gets really, really serious, because indirectly most of this stuff is related to foreign policy.
Yeah.
And declaration of war. They're just so open about it. Just think of Truman. Truman did a couple things, but not many. But the worst thing is he established immediately, just shortly after the UN was established, that and shortly after World War II ended, he says, "Well, we have to do this to save the world." And he says, "Well, no, this is." Somebody asked him about the war. He said, "This is not a war. This is just a police action." Golly. Exactly. So they get away with that, but they shouldn't. You need more people like Green in there, and there are a few, but it really boils down to a prevailing attitude, a philosophy of society, what comes out of our universities, what comes out of the very rich lobbyists and going on. The system is rotten, because the lobbyists are really running. It's all about the deep state.
Yeah. I mean, it's just incredible, and I'm glad she did it. Speaker Johnson's supposed to be a fighter for Republican causes. All the abortion money's in there. All the Ukraine money's in there. And the FISA. That's the big thing, because that was supposed to at least be a fight to extend that eavesdropping on American citizens. That should have been a fight. Nope, they rolled over on that as well. It's disgusting.
I should mention that Plato, however, regarded communism as the ideal, but as impractical applied to the masses, because their appetites are simply too strong, they wouldn't stand for it. They have to have their own little families and private property and so on, and Plato said we may as well in effect appease them, because it's useless to try to get them to live the ideal life. Nevertheless, the true philosophers live that way according to Plato. As we've seen, they have all property in common, and Plato insists they must have all wives and children in common also, which will not bother them, because as true philosophers they're not interested in sex anyway. And says Plato, this will also help to remove any conceivable temptation from their paths, because there's no longer the possibility that they will be ambitious for their children. Their wives and children will be taken away at birth. The children will be taken away at birth, and will be brought up and supervised, educated by the state. Plato also adds that there will be yearly mating festivals among the philosophers, and that although the lower philosophers will be told that this is taking place simply by lot, that the partner you get is simply your good or bad luck, the actual truth is that the oldest, most senior philosophers will have studied the eugenic construction of the philosophers and will mate the ones that are eugenically best to produce the highest breed. And the others will just in effect have bad luck at the lots. Now you ask the question, well, won't the guardians, the philosophers, be unhappy living in this life? Living this manner of life? And Plato says in answer to that, quote, "Our aim in founding the Commonwealth was not to make any one class specially happy, but to secure the greatest possible happiness for the community as a whole. We are not trying to secure the well-being of a select few. It is as if we were coloring a statue." You understand, in Greece they tinted the statues. "And someone came up and blamed us for not putting the most beautiful colors on the noblest parts of the figure. The eyes, for instance, he says, should be painted crimson, but we had made them black. We should think it a fair answer to say, really, you must not expect us to paint eyes so handsome as not to look like eyes at all. This applies to all the parts. The question is whether by giving each its proper color, we make the whole beautiful. So too in the present case. You must not press us to endow our guardians with a happiness that will make them anything rather than guardians." Unquote. You see the complete collectivism of the Platonic mentality. Individuals are simply unimportant. What counts is the group. And the group is something over and above the individuals. It can be happy even if all the constituents are miserable. Madness is getting its whatever it deserves, even if men are miserable. So we have a giant organism with the men of reason living communistically, ruling over the lowest class, the lower classes assisted by these spirited auxiliaries, everybody as much as possible being systematically inculcated by the desire to serve the state and obey the rulers. Which brings us to the question, what are the functions of the guardians? What areas of man's life are they to control? Everything. Plato's theory is total, and if you make an adjective of that, you get totalitarian. He modeled himself on Sparta, which was completely statist and heavily admired by Plato. Education, says Plato, must be thoroughly controlled by the state. We must have a thoroughgoing censorship of literature, music, philosophy, science. We will allow people to hear only those ideas that are good for them, as judged, of course, by the authorities, the philosophers. We will tell people lies, so-called noble lies. That is to say, lies that are for the good of the people, as and when it turns out to be necessary. In other words, we're going to engage in out-and-out brainwashing. And there's no objection to this because the masses' reason is simply so weak that they won't respond to arguments. And so we have to simply condition people emotionally to blind obedience. As one unsympathetic but accurate commentator says, describing this point, quote, "It is pointless, for instance, to try to explain to the masses the organic nature of the state and the corresponding need of each individual to subordinate his immediate interest to the whole, for they cannot grasp such abstract concepts. But loyalty and patriotism are attitudes of mind easily inculcated, and they serve the same purpose of producing social cohesion, self-sacrifice, obedience to command, etc. Flag-waving, patriotic music, and tales about heroic forefathers must therefore occupy a large part of the school curriculum. It is quite beside the point if the tales told the children are untrue, provided they are thus inspired to conduct which is best for the state." I can't resist interjecting, of course, the blatant parallel between this and Nazism among dozens of other movements. And the commentator continues, "And if on the one hand we see to it that certain things are taught, we must be equally careful to see that other things are not taught. Since the whole basis of this education is an appeal to emotion rather than intellect, it is of vital importance that the wrong sorts of emotion and desire, fear for instance or greed, are not stirred, that good emotions are not associated with the wrong sorts of objects, loyalty to one's family or class, for instance, instead of loyalty to the rulers as the symbol of the state as a whole. Thus, in Plato's state, the ministry of propaganda and public enlightenment and its complement, the ministry of censorship, are of the first importance." Unquote. And so they are. Needless to say, all careers are to be controlled completely. Vocational tests will be given out, in which the board of philosophers assigned to vocational guidance will determine your ability and assign you to the job where you best fit the state, regardless of your desires. And if you say, well, I object, what about my own happiness? I don't want to do this particular work. They will say, look, you're a cell of the body of society. Suppose a man had to walk through mud to reach his goal, and his foot could speak and said to him, I don't want to get dirty. You'd say, you're a foot. And if necessary, you'll get dirty or get cut off. And the same applies to an individual in relation to the state. There will, of course, be economic controls. Extremes of wealth have to be controlled, said Plato. We can't have poverty and we can't have extreme wealth. In general, it's a complete totalitarianism. In the Laws, in particular, his last dialogue, he works out the details of totalitarianism thoroughly, with detailed laws covering everything, from the banishment of atheists to the detailed rules of trading various types of commodity, etc. He has the whole pattern worked out in exhaustive detail. It is, by the way, not a popular dialogue among Platonists because it is simply blatantly totalitarian. They like the Republic better, which is earlier and a little woozier, but not much. Now, Plato's philosophy on these questions has been the blueprint ever since for dictatorial, totalitarian schemes of every variety. He is the rock underlying and making possible and constantly appealed to by the medieval theocrats and the defenders of the absolute monarchies in the early modern world and the communists and the fascists and the Nazis. And therefore, I suggest that sometime or other you read the Republic, where it's clearly outlined and very easy to follow.
So U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner said on Thursday that the Biden administration has not set a deadline on Israel's war in Gaza and reiterated U.S. opposition to a ceasefire. Feiner said, quote, "We have not given a firm deadline to Israel, not really our role. That is their conflict. That said, we do have influence, even if we don't have ultimate control over what happens on the ground in Gaza," end quote. So when it comes to the timeline of this war, how long it could last, there was a report in Financial Times last week that cited Israeli sources who said they expect it to last over a year. I mean, imagine this thing going on for a whole year. U.S. officials have said that they expect the current phase in the war, referring to the ground operations and the constant bombardment, they expect that to last into 2024. And then at some point, they're saying Israel will probably narrow down its operations to take out specific Hamas fighters. They say that could happen as soon as January. But who knows? I mean, Israel seems to be pretty happy with just obliterating the Gaza Strip. Feiner said that the U.S. supports Israel's goal of ensuring that Hamas can no longer govern. Although we've seen Netanyahu and Israeli officials, they're constantly saying their goal is to eliminate Hamas, which is a different goal from what the U.S. is saying, that to make sure they can't govern Gaza. Feiner said that the U.S. is, quote, not in place yet of asking Israel to stop or for a ceasefire, end quote. So reiterating that no ceasefire, we want to continue supporting this thing. Gaza's health ministry put out another casualty update on Thursday. They said at least 17,177 Palestinians have been killed since October 7th, and that total includes about 70% of that is women and children. And their death toll is considered to be on the low end, something that the U.S. State Department has admitted. They're not accounting for the people buried under the rubble, which is in the thousands. There's thousands of people who are missing. They don't have heavy machinery to properly dig people out. So the Financial Times report cited a source who said that Israel was not near halfway to achieving its objectives. And the death toll that an Israeli military source said when it comes to the Hamas fighters, they're claiming that they've killed 5,000 Hamas members, although there were other reports citing Israeli sources who put the death toll between 1,000 and 2,000. Either way, who knows if these estimates are accurate, but either way, they've killed more children than both of them. I believe the child death toll is now around 7,000, which is just horrific. So the Senate on Thursday voted down a resolution that would have directed President Biden to withdraw all U.S. troops from Syria, where U.S. forces have come under frequent attack in response to President Biden's support for Israel's Gaza onslaught. The bill failed in a vote of 13 to 84, so it didn't do very well, but it did receive bipartisan support. 7 Democrats voted for it, 5 Republicans, and 1 independent, which was Bernie Sanders. The resolution was introduced by Senator Rand Paul, who argued the U.S. occupation of eastern Syria risks a major regional war. Paul said, quote, keeping 900 U.S. troops in Syria does nothing to advance American security. Rather, our intervention puts those service members at grave risk by providing an enticing target for Iranian-backed militias. Our continued presence risks the United States getting dragged into yet another regional war in the Middle East without debate or a vote by the people's representatives in Congress. Congress must cease abdicating its constitutional war powers to the executive branch, end quote. So this bill would have directed Biden to withdraw the troops within 30 days unless he could get a authorization from Congress. So this resolution received support from Robert Ford, who's a former U.S. ambassador to Syria. In fact, he was the U.S. ambassador to Syria under Obama from 2011 to 2014 when the U.S. threw its weight behind the regime change operation against Bashar al-Assad. And he has been supportive of lately in recent time with getting the U.S. withdrawing from Syria and lifting sanctions, saying, somebody very involved in the beginning of the U.S. intervention against Assad and what has led to that brutal war and all the funding of these extremist groups in Syria, and now kind of the where we're at now, it's a continuation with the sanctions that the U.S. has on Syria. They're specifically designed to prevent the country from rebuilding after that war and this occupation of eastern Syria. And this guy Ford thinks it should end. So he said, quote, we owe our soldiers serving there in harm's way a serious debate about whether their mission is in fact achievable. Absent a debate and authorization of such a mission, our troops should be removed, end quote. Ukrainian officials traveled to Washington this week to attend a conference on building up Ukraine's own military-industrial complex to reduce its reliance on the West for military equipment. Opening the conference on Wednesday, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said the U.S. and its allies would work to strengthen Ukraine's defense industrial base, which is the new lingo for military-industrial complex. And he's saying this will maintain Ukraine's current war effort and bolster the deterrence in the future. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan told Reuters, quote, Ukraine becoming more self-sufficient in weapons production obviously alleviates the long-term need for continued supply of weapons from the United States and other Western countries, end quote. The U.S. and Ukraine are also looking to jointly produce arms. A Ukrainian minister who attended the conference said that Kiev had an agreement with 2 American companies to jointly manufacture 155mm artillery shells, which are in short supply as the U.S. has shipped millions to support the war against Russia. I believe they've giving Ukraine over 2 million of those artillery shells.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
All right, today is December 7th, Pearl Harbor Day. Before Pearl Harbor, some 80% of the Americans were opposed to getting involved in the war going on in Europe. But Pearl Harbor came, boop, changed. Oh, I mentioned the dot-com bust. The dot-com bust. You know what ended the dot-com bust? The war on terror. That's right. The little Georgie Bush with a pair of cojones smaller than a mothball, a stupid, moronic piece of garbage scum. We're going to get that guy Osama bin Laden dead or alive. Although Afghanistan had nothing to do with it, and we wrote in detail they wanted to have peace talks, and he wouldn't let them. 81% of the people swallowed his crap. Everybody forgot about the dot-com bust. Now let's go back to World War II. There was a thing called the Great Depression. That's right. World War II came. When all else fails, they take you to war. This is from this day in history. Mainstream site. United States freezes Japanese assets. On July 26, 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt seizes all Japanese assets in the United States. You know why? In retaliation for the Japanese occupation of French Indochina. Why, those dirty Japs. How dare they go into French Indochina when the French are in Cambodia, when the French are in Laos and Vietnam, stealing their rubber, stealing their tin, raping, robbing, pillaging. Why, those dirty Japanese? And as an American, what the fuck do I care? It gets better. Japan followed up by occupying Cam Ranh Naval Base in Vietnam, which was only 800 miles from the Philippines, where Americans had troops, and the British base in Singapore. What the fuck is America doing with troops in the Philippines? And the British, the sun never sets on the British Empire. We slaughter and kill people all over the world, and we're in Singapore. And again, don't forget to subscribe here, because you get notified. We're putting out what nobody else is putting out, so share this video. Nobody's saying what I'm saying right now. It gets better. President Roosevelt swung into action by freezing all Japanese assets in America. Britain and the Dutch East Indies followed suit. Dutch East Indies? What the fuck are the Dutch doing in Indonesia? What's wrong with you, Salenti? We're stealing, robbing, and killing like we always do. So now the result. You ready? Japan lost access to 3/4 of its overseas trade and 88% of its imported oil. 88% of its oil. They only import 100%. Can't understand why they bombed Pearl Harbor. I don't understand. All right? You go on to the Israel war, same thing. 39 weeks of protests against Netanyahu's judicial reform. The guy, week after week, there's your Trends Journal from when Netanyahu got into office back in late 2022. We put week after week after week what they were doing to the Palestinians and Lebanon and Syria, ramping this up. Now go back to the protests going on. Isaac Herzog, the president of Israel, called this, what was going on with the people protesting week after week, hundreds of thousands taking the street, a civil war in Israel. October 7th happens, the terrible massacre created by Hamas. Everybody forgot about it. And they all united against Gaza and Hamas, bombs away. Nobody talks about the 39 weeks. When all those fails, they take you to war. And let's go on to also the data coming out that we began with Phil Giraldi, former top CIA guy, saying Israel had the best intelligence in the world. They knew this was happening. And now the data is coming out showing that that's the truth. So they knew this was going to happen, and they let it happen. So, again, you got political freaks in charge, and that's why you need your T-shirt here. Hey, politicians, who the fuck are you to tell me what to do? Here's another story. Students suffered biggest setbacks in pandemic. Yeah, no shit. We said this was going to happen, and it wasn't a pandemic. The World Health Organization called it a pandemic on March 11th, 2020, when the grand total of 4,219 people died out of 8 billion. That many die a day, choking maybe. But again, it fucked up everything. The damage done by the COVID war is incalculable. So now, in ending this, I'm going to say the same thing I say all the time. People say, why do you do this? Why? I say, I want to get out of here on a high note. I'm trying to do everything I can for peace, and I'm fighting for every ounce of energy that I have to do it. How can you be so stupid to call these people leaders? I want to make this clear. I was not put on this earth to be led. I won't be led, and I don't want to lead. But maybe you want little Mikey Johnson, who said, yeah, he's been talking to God. God told him to lead. Yeah, lead you down a crap hole of crap. So thanks for tuning in. Check out the video I did yesterday with Judge Napolitano.
So I think you might remember this, and we may have even spoken about it. About a month ago, Senator Richard Blumenthal, liberal Democrat of Connecticut, and Senator Mitt Romney, conservative, in his own words, Republican of Utah, and a former Republican nominee for president, said that the Ukraine war was the best of all worlds. We were getting the biggest bang for our buck, and no American was dying. Did they forget the generation of Ukrainian young men wiped out? According to Colonel Douglas McGregor, 500,000 either killed or so disabled they can't go back to the military.
Yeah, I mean, they've been cynically and immorally feeding these Ukrainians into the maw of death, at the cost of the American taxpayer, and it's just a crime. We have been abetting and aiding this ongoing war, which is getting nowhere, which will end exactly where it started, with the Donbass region being maintained by Putin. There's very little likelihood that that's going to change, and yet they want to continue it. And they have displaced, in addition to 500,000 some troops dying, they have displaced millions of Ukrainians because of this conflict.
And the members of Congress see no harm in this. In fact, as just stated, they see the opposite. They see joy.
Incredible. I mean, so they're really bent on destabilizing and, effectively creating a coup, a regime change in Russia. That's really the ultimate objective. And they really think that they can affect this through this insane funding and arming. But it's not going to lead to that at all. In fact, Putin's position economically and militarily have only been enhanced. This is a fool's errand and a criminal activity. It's incredible that the Congress has no scruples, apparently, about funding this particular campaign.
If Putin takes Ukraine, he won't stop there. It's important to see the long run here. He's going to keep going. He's made that pretty clear. Putin attacks a NATO ally. Then we'll have something that we don't seek and that we don't have today. American troops fighting Russian troops. American troops fighting Russian troops. He moves into other parts of NATO. Extreme Republicans are playing chicken with our national security, holding Ukraine funding hostage to their extreme partisan border policies. And now they're willing to literally kneecap Ukraine on the battlefield and damage our national security in the process. Look, I know we have our divisions at home. Let's get past them. This is critical. Petty partisan angry politics can't get in the way of our responsibility as a leading nation in the world. We can't let Putin win. Say it again, we can't let Putin win. It's in our overwhelming national interest and international interest of all our friends.
Oh, I mean, Biden's remarks were premised on lies to start. He's suggesting that Russia will not stop at Ukraine. Meanwhile, there's no threat that Russia is going to take all of Ukraine. That's not even its objective. As a matter of fact, as has been revealed, there was, in fact, a peace negotiation in which Russia effectively said they would stop the war if, in fact, Ukraine promised not to become a NATO partner. So this whole idea that Russia wants to take over other parts of Eastern Europe is insane, and it's a complete lie. It's complete balderdash. And it is ridiculous that the United States Congress is putting as a priority, and I mean the Senate and Congress here, the security of Ukraine while our own border is completely wide open. And they will not, and it's called far right, to want to secure that border. That's called a far right-wing position. So I guess a non-far right position is just to allow unfettered immigrants, unfettered immigration to pour into the country, and we have no idea whether these people have our best interests at heart at all. They may, in fact, be terrorists. So, I mean, it's a ball of lies. There's absolutely no truth to what Biden is saying, and it has to be rejected. I hope that this funding to Ukraine ends immediately, because this is a fruitless, absolute fool's errand that we're on here in terms of funding and arming.
You and I, and a lot of people watching us now, believe in natural rights, that our rights come from our humanity, whether you believe in an almighty, all-knowing, all-loving God, or whether you think that human beings are the highest rational beings on the planet. We accept the view that our rights come from our humanity, and as Jefferson called them, they're inalienable. what is the moral dimension to this slaughter? What is the moral, the natural law analysis or understanding of this kind of slaughter?
Oh, there's natural rights law, but also from the libertarian perspective, there's something called the non-aggression principle. And that is that you are not to initiate force against another person on your own without it being a defensive action. Now, in the case of civilians, in the case of war in general, I would argue, it's impossible not to violate the non-aggression principle because always there's this so-called collateral damage with war. And we have a case where there's millions of people in Gaza that haven't done anything. They haven't initiated any violence against anyone, and yet they're being killed and maimed and displaced and their property utterly destroyed. This is a clear violation of the non-aggression principle. And this is why the parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, can't come down on any two issues in the same way because they have no principles from which to operate. And so I argue that the principle that we should operate from is the non-aggression principle. Unless it's a defensive move, unless you're defending yourself, your person and your property, you have no right to initiate force against anyone. And that's what's happening in Gaza. That's what's happening in the West Bank as well. And that's why, the lack of this principle is why you have both Republicans and Democrats solidly behind this slaughter, with a few exceptions.
Here. You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network. Scott Horton sent me this, but there's John Robb on his Substack wrote this piece, and I got to say, Rob, you really called this one, and I think you called it pretty early on. I think our first, I have to go back and check, but I think our first show on this was on October 8th. I think we did a show the day after the attack, or we recorded it the day after the attack. It was one of the ones in a hotel room. I can't remember where we were. I think it was at the casino up at Mohegan Sun. We did one in my hotel room. But I think you said pretty early on in this that you were like, the Israel's going to have a really tough time selling this. It's just not going to go over well. Well, I highly encourage people to go read John Robb's Substack piece. It's called Israel's Online Front Collapses. And they're basically talking about what you predicted all coming true. And that the whole, in terms of like TV media, Israel's still kind of doing okay, controlling the narrative. But in terms of online, it has just totally collapsed. And support for them has just evaporated.
And before we even get into, the claim I had made is I just watched a building collapse. I don't know how you sell this. Like you just got put under a microscope. We're seeing what's happening. I don't know how you spin this. It doesn't make me feel good. I'm watching you kill civilians. Like I can see it. When I can literally see it, it's very hard to escape it, spin it, say, well, we dropped a leaflet. We told them they have to leave. I just saw it. I saw a building with civilians collapse. I don't know. It's like watching the Twin Towers collapse. I saw it happen. Right. You're not going to spin it the other way. You're not going to tell me, well, like they were harboring terrorists, the kids in there deserve, like, I don't know what you're going to tell me. I saw it. But Israel is also seemingly cartoonishly bad at social media when they did that campaign on the kids' videos where, hey, we know that your child can't see this, but give them a hug for their loved ones because we just lost ours and now we need your support. And then this was incredible. They kept claiming that that they needed to go after that hospital because it was the main artery, or it was the main base that they were running operations out of. And then they got this video of this guy.
Al-Shifa Hospital, yeah.
Yeah. And then they pivoted really quickly to, well, we're still looking for evidence. And look, there's a tunnel here. And then there was like less guns than what I've seen when, the police do a raid on a building in New York City and they go, look at all the guns we took off the street. And then they had this guy who goes, look, tunnel, Hamas. And then instantly, they were just making fun of that guy online and pointing at like hobbits and stuff. Look, Hamas. So
the crazy part about that, did we ever talk about it? So for people who don't know, what happened here was Israel had a raid on a hospital. And let's just say the standards are pretty high for how that would ever be legally permissible in a war. And so Israel put out this like computer generated graphic of what was under the hospital. And it was like, it reminded me of one of those Osama bin Laden, remember they used to do his caves where he had these crazy, like high sophisticated with tons of computers. It all turned out to be complete bullshit. They just made up these images. It's literally no different than when my daughter draws a picture and just makes something up out of her imagination.
Working with porn tapes. He didn't even have internet.
Yeah. He was jerking off to magazines.
Yeah,
I was going to say. Osama bin Laden and the other Al-Qaeda guys all had to go to the woods to try to find a porno mag. But so they put out this, the Israeli government put out this computer generated image of how sophisticated this thing was. And that this was the central command for Hamas. And so we just had to raid this hospital. And yes, it's tragic and we hate that we had to do it, but we did. So then they go, and what they show us as proof were a couple of rifles in one of the rooms in the hospital. Now, look, maybe we really just have no way of knowing, because also the IDF doesn't let journalists come in until they've cleared the area. So we have no way of knowing whether these rifles were planted there or the rifles were really there, but I'm perfectly willing to believe that they were, in fact. And I think there was one person who worked at the hospital who did say that like some Hamas guys had been in the hospital and stuff. So I'm not even claiming none of that's accurate. But then they basically showed you the opening to a tunnel, and they show you the opening to a tunnel and they go, look, see, tunnel. And then journalists wanted to go in. They won't let them. They said, we can't go in because it might be booby trapped. And look, again, fair enough. It might be booby trapped. If that is a Hamas tunnel, you're like, yeah, that seems like it's a reasonable thing. That could happen. Maybe it takes time to get in there. Then, very strangely, in an interview, the former prime minister of Israel, Barak, is talking to this interviewer, and they go, they ask him, how can you be sure that there are tunnels under this hospital? And he goes, well, we know there's tunnels under the hospital because we built them. And he goes, I'm sorry, did you misspeak? You're saying you built them? And he's like, yes, we built them. He goes, we built this tunnel under this hospital back when we occupied
I
Gaza.
didn't hear about that part of it.
So now he says, and the reason for it was something about how they wanted to expand the hospital or something like that. So once that's said, you go, oh, well, now just discovering a tunnel isn't evidence of anything. Now, it's possible that Hamas took over these tunnels that Israel was building and were using them, but now just showing me a tunnel doesn't mean anything because Israel built the tunnel. You already knew the tunnel was there. Anyway, they claim that they found some more weapons in this after they had like robots go in or something like that. But the bottom line is that
they walked it back. It's pivoted to we're looking for evidence, and look, there's a tunnel, and look at there's this, which was a very different claim than
nothing like that computer generated image that they first used as a justification to go sack this hospital. And really horrible. I mean, I don't even want to like get into some of it, but there's some really gruesome stories of what happened as a result of that raid to the hospital.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Elon Musk had just bought Twitter. I think it was like November 2022, last year, about a full year away. He invited Barry Weiss and some other reporters to come to Twitter headquarters and like trawl through the Twitter databases. And she had looked me up, and there's a picture of me in the Twitter database with the words, little box, trends blacklist underneath it. I was put on a blacklist by Twitter. Elon invited me to go visit Twitter, and I saw what Twitter had done. I asked them to go crawl back to figure out when was I put on the blacklist. It turns out I was put on the blacklist in August of 2021 when I first joined Twitter. All I tweeted was the Great Barrington Declaration. And of course, there was previous to that, there was the revelation that the head of the National Institute of Health had called for a devastating takedown of me and my Great Barrington Declaration colleagues, professors from Harvard and Oxford, calling us fringe epidemiologists, and leading to essentially hit pieces by the Washington Post, New York Times, it's falsely accusing us of wanting to let the virus rip when we were calling for better focused protection of vulnerable older people. So it was really clear that there were government actors that were abusing their power to destroy any intellectual opposition to their policies, even before the Elon Musk purchase of Twitter and the Twitter blacklist revelation. But that just put a nail on it. And then there was the Missouri versus Biden case, on which this debate topic hinges, and that really opened the door to what the government was doing. And Tom, it's not just that they named particular people, which they absolutely did. The government would go to Twitter and to Facebook and Reddit or whatever and say to them, look, if you don't censor these people, then we're going to take regulatory action. But they would do more than that. They would say, you have to censor these ideas if you have these themes. And then they've outsourced it to places like Stanford, the Stanford Internet Observatory, just to develop essentially like trawlnet algorithms to say, here's the whole range of things you should be censoring. Here are the bad misinformation themes that are coming up. Ironically, many of those misinformation themes turned out to be absolutely true. And yet, so the government outsourced its censorship, laundered its censorship activities to private entities like Stanford. And then the government directly went to companies like Twitter, to social media, and said, look, you better censor these people and these ideas very broadly, or else, because you're just to give a concrete example. Turns out that Facebook needed the Biden administration to negotiate with the EU regarding data security, right? Because the EU essentially has all these regulations that puts Facebook business model at essentially a direct threat. And so what the Biden administration told Facebook, in effect, was that if you don't listen to us on censorship, we're not going to negotiate on your behalf in front of the EU, and your company will get destroyed. It was such an obvious direct violation of the American First Amendment that the federal judges that have looked after this, and this not just doesn't include the July 4th ruling by the Judge Terry Doughty but also a 3-judge panel in the Fifth Circuit. They both mentioned, Doughty calls it a ministry of truth, basically pointing to Orwell's 1984. That's the kind of activity. The 3-judge panel essentially endorses that view as essentially the biggest violation of the American First Amendment, certainly in this century, maybe even in 100 years. So I look forward to that ruling. I actually look forward to the debate because I'm curious to see what my opponent, what she's the one that suggested the wording of the debate topic, I think. The word hindered, like what does it mean to hinder internet policy? Hindering internet policy such that the American government can violate the First Amendment at scale? That's really, I think, what is the content of what the debate is about.
Now, we can respond to that in two ways. Number one, we can address the merits of the things being censored, or we can just speak on the principle of the thing. That unfortunately, in a free society, maybe some people do say some things that are false. But the problem is, if you try to correct that, who gets to do the correcting? That's the question we get no answer to. Or if it's, quote, the scientific consensus said to put everybody on a ventilator in early 2020.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you give a nice articulation of the devil's advocate view, but you also answered you devil's
I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself, Jay. I couldn't help it.
I mean, I think let's look at that as carefully as we can and honestly as we can. All right. So the idea that somehow the federal government has in its employ a set of people who are so wise and so perspicacious that they can see forward into time about which direction every single scientific debate is going to go, and then in advance suppress the people that will take the wrong side of it. Right. So probably this is best personified by someone like Tony Fauci, who gave an interview, I think, to CNN, where he bragged that if you criticize me, you are not simply criticizing a man, you are criticizing science itself. The premise then is that the federal government and it has essentially a church-like power to tell the difference between sheep and goats. Like the people who are going to be condemned to hell, the people who are going to go to heaven. They can decree from on high the outcome of scientific debates that are still ongoing. Even if you believe that it's true that they have better scientific knowledge than the assembled masses, they might be wrong. I mean, the way science works, and you already presaged the answer to this. It's very commonly the case that the scientific consensus in one day is overturned basically overnight by a whole series of facts. And if you act on the false scientific consensus at scale with the power of a government to close businesses, keep kids out of school for 2 years, to essentially interdict international trade for years on end, cause mass panic and fear at scale, what's going to happen is a great deal of harm, a great deal of damage is going to be done to people.
Start out talking about the Whiskey Rebellion. And this is a great piece by Murray Rothbard over at the Mises Institute. Of course, it'll be linked to in the show notes. Alan Mosley will get that organized, and I will get it published in the next couple of hours after the live stream is done here over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. But you should check this out. The Whiskey Rebellion, a model for our time by Murray Rothbard. And he puts it this way. The official view of the Whiskey Rebellion is that 4 counties of western Pennsylvania refused to pay an excise tax on whiskey that had been levied by a proposal of the Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, in the spring of 1791. Western Pennsylvanians failed to pay the tax, this view says, until protests, demonstrations, and some roughing up of tax collectors in western PA caused President Washington to call up a 13,000-man army in the summer and fall of 1794 to suppress the insurrection. And Rothbard sums up the official view with this. A localized but dramatic challenge to federal tax levying authority had been met and defeated. The forces of federal law and order were safe. Now, Rothbard makes it very clear that this is just the official view. It's a government propaganda view. And he says the official view turns out to be dead wrong. What a surprise that so much in history is written by the supposed winners, by the people in power. And we always get a kind of a twisted version of it. Now, he just kind of rips through this whole official view. He said the main distortion of the official view of the Whiskey Rebellion was its alleged confinement to 4 counties of western Pennsylvania. From recent research, we now know that no one paid the tax on whiskey throughout the American backcountry. That is the frontier areas of Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina, Georgia, and the entire state of Kentucky. Now, I don't know if it's a zero, but I see no indication that the whiskey tax was collected in any large numbers. In fact, it was very, very low. And in some areas, there was no collection whatsoever. Now, Rothbard continues with this. President Washington and Secretary Hamilton chose to make a fuss about western Pennsylvania. This was a political strategy on their point. About western Pennsylvania, they made a fuss about it precisely because in that region, there was a cadre of wealthy officials who were willing to collect taxes. Such a cadre did not even exist in the other areas of the American frontier. There was no fuss or violence against tax collectors in Kentucky, for example, and the rest of the backcountry, because there was no one willing to be a tax collector. If you think about the situation in comparison to what they did to the tax collectors in response to the Stamp Act, it's this very similar type of an approach. Now, Rothbard points out that Western PA was really just the tip of the iceberg. Pretty much everywhere else, it just was not really paid at all. And government today, whether it's state or federal, they often take this same kind of approach that Rothbard points out that Washington and Hamilton did. They make a big fuss, they make a big show of force in one area when there is widespread resistance to something because they want to make an example out of people. They want to make sure everyone knows that they mean business. They hope that it's going to scare off people in other areas. But if the people hold firm, the people in the states can win, which is exactly what we're seeing play out before our very eyes in response to prohibition on cannabis. Over the years, they've really ramped up enforcement, but generally they focus on one area. Just before Colorado opened up their legalization a number of years ago, the Peace President administration conducted the largest series of raids around the state in state history as a warning. 6 weeks before they started their legalization, retail sales, they're basically saying, hey, we're going to come in and shut you down. But that just never happens because they run out of resources if the people and the states continue to take a stand. But anyways, let's get back to Rothbard here. Here's what he has to say. Let me pull it up on the screen. Rather than the whiskey tax rebellion being localized and swiftly put down, the true story turns out to be very different. The entire American backcountry was gripped by a nonviolent, civil disobedient refusal to pay the hated tax on whiskey. So a vast majority of the people just refused to comply. This is exactly what James Madison said needed to be done to keep the feds in check in Federalist number 46. Rothbard says no local juries could be found to convict tax delinquents. The whiskey rebellion was actually widespread and successful, for it eventually forced the federal government to repeal the excise tax. And this is, as I just mentioned, this is really the same type of strategy that was used to nullify the Stamp Act back in 1765. It was a series of protests, noncompliance, pressuring local officials to step down, even having some local officials refuse to follow the Stamp Act. There was some local courts in Maryland, for example, that said it was unconstitutional, and no one was required to obey it. So it's the same approach, and it had a very positive effect. In 1765, we saw the same thing play out in response to the whiskey tax, despite the fact that the physical resistance in Western Pennsylvania melted away in the face of a large kind of George Washington-led military force. But I covered the resistance to the Stamp Act in another episode that I think you'll find interesting, the People's Nullification of the Stamp Act, which really highlights a lot of the work from Murray Rothbard as well. Now, Rothbard sums this all up like this. He said, Washington, Hamilton, and the cabinet covered up the extent of the revolution because they didn't want to advertise the extent of their failure. They knew very well that if they tried to enforce or send an army into the rest of the back country, they would have failed. Kentucky and perhaps the other areas would have seceded from the Union then and there. Both contemporary sides were happy to cover up the truth, and historians fell for the deception. And a lot of people are still repeating that propaganda. We hear it all the time. Just like George Washington, they'll shut you down. And it's not the case. It just didn't happen like that. The Whiskey Rebellion, then, Rothbard sums up, considered properly, was a victory for liberty and property rather than for federal taxation.
Okay, now what's the purpose of this nihilism and my truth? It's because when you get into this mind virus, you become putty in the hands of the authoritarians. They become your source of truth. You know, you can't turn anywhere, but they, with their might, will tell you this is true because we say it's true. And that's what we went through with COVID. Remember when Fauci claimed to be the science? And what was it, New Zealand? Ardern, I believe. She says, we are the source of truth. And of course it was false, what they were saying. But that's the purpose of this nihilism, this my truth nonsense. And, and you got to get out of it. It's like a cult, and learn what is true so that you could at least survive and prosper.
Right. But, in order to maintain the empire, one of the first things that they have to do, and they're working diligently on this, and that is they have to destroy the principles of the First Amendment. You just can't give out opinions. That's dangerous. And now it's announced by the enemy that just saying something is violence. The libertarian principles, you can't use any violence and you can't use aggression. But now they're saying verbaling, expressing yourself is a threat to people, and therefore therefore what you say is equivalent to holding up somebody with a gun. But the one thing they exclude is, yes, they want the government to get involved in that and describe all these things, but they never apply these strict rules, which aren't just bad rules altogether. What they do is they exclude the government. If you and I can't do certain things, if we have to obey, governments don't have to. They have the power and the authority which people too often grant to them, and they don't wake up quickly, and we're in the process of doing that. And then the government then, are overwhelmingly more powerful than the people. Except there is some opposition to that, and one of them is there is a higher law. And there's still the majority of people believe in the higher law. You shouldn't lie, cheat, and steal and kill, and that's been there since Sumeria. Even well before the 10th Commandment. Those rules have been there, and deep down in the heart of all these authoritarians who want to use all this power on their own and the power they give the government, they know that. And when things get bad, which they are, all of a sudden they'll start saying, well, maybe we should be in this war. Maybe we should be more cautious right now. We're being more cautious about expanding our role in the Middle East. We've been doing it a lot, and they're talking about slowing up a little bit in Ukraine. And it took decades in the Middle East as well as in Vietnam to finally wise up and quit doing this. But there were rules about it. It was the breaking the economic laws. Economic laws are very, very powerful. So yes, there's a lot of evil done when they control the money and they become the counterfeiters, but it won't last, and then that is expressed by higher prices, and the people don't like that, and they wake up and know something has to be done. But that requires, to get them to do the right thing, that requires on our part and others to make sure that the people themselves know what you have to do. And if you have to cut spending to save the country and save the economy, you better understand why it's done. So that's an educational matter, and we try our best to get involved in that as well.
So you need a big web of lies in order to maintain it. Our government, unfortunately, over the last 100 years, has become the global busybody. It deems itself the arbiter around the world. And predictably, everything is failing around it, even in foreign policy. Failed wars, they're endless. They keep just one piling after another. The currency is failing. Inflation is getting out of hand. And if they keep printing, it'll really get out of hand. Our cities are a total mess. I live an hour from a city. I don't even go there anymore. There's moral failure with the people. That's quite obvious. Just go on to social media and see how people speak to one another, and you'll see the moral failure. Legal failure. We have two-tiered legal systems. Some people, have to obey the law, and some don't. There's failure in trust in the media. To anybody who still puts that TV on, you really have to trust them. There's medical, failure with COVID, just the lies there. Education, school, we could go on and on and on. And eventually the people, they become numb to it. It starts to lose its potency, all the lies. They could speak all the lies that they want, and that's what happened with the Soviets. Nobody believed them anymore. And that was the beginning of the end. So that's in our future at some point. Let's just hope the end was as peaceful as it was for the Soviets.
It's a choice between authoritarianism and voluntarism. And people being left alone, they will use the method of how people get ahead is through merit, how they do things. Do they follow the rules? Are they honest? And that is what makes society a much better society, rather than saying what we need is more authoritarianism from the government, no more rules. And just think of all the pages of regulations that we have at the federal level. And the people who campaign for getting rid of them, they never reduce the number of pages in the Federal Register. So someday there's a lot of people now who are sick and tired of it, and they're starting to avoid them and ignore them. 80% of the people now don't trust what the government tells us. Those are healthy trends, because the people will finally wake up. Well, if we're not going to depend on our government, what are we going to depend on? And as far as I'm concerned, the only option we should have is promoting the cause of liberty. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.
Now it's common on the part of people who don't like totalitarianism, but who accept entirely the basic ethics and metaphysics of Plato. In other words, they accept the altruist collectivist viewpoint, but don't like complete totalitarianism. It's common of them immediately to say it won't work. We shouldn't have this kind of society. It would be good, but it wouldn't work. And of course, it's true, it wouldn't work. But the reason it wouldn't work is because of the ethics and the metaphysics underlying it. It's based on an anti-life, otherworldly ethics. And of course, life on Earth is impossible under such a system, and no such system will work. But you cannot combat it by simply saying it wouldn't work, not if you accept the foundations from which it comes. And I'll go you one better. You might be surprised to know that Plato was the first one who said it wouldn't work. And he even gave an explanation why it wouldn't work. It wouldn't work, he said, because after all, my whole political philosophy is theory. And what's good in theory doesn't necessarily work in practice. He originated that one too. And that one follows directly from his metaphysics. Because when we theorize, what are we focusing on? The world of forms. When we practice, when we act, what world are we in? This physical, imperfect, transitory, appetitive, sensory world. Well, we couldn't expect then that all our theories are going to work perfectly down here in this world. In fact, we have to expect they wouldn't work very well because of all the non-being and contradictions and imperfection in this world. And therefore, there has to be a dichotomy between theory and practice. And therefore, the people who say it's good in theory but won't work in practice are thoroughgoing Platonists, even if they never heard of universals. Now, of course, that dichotomy between theory and practice has had its own devastating effect. It's led to two kinds of men. The self-declared practical, who despise theory and the intellect, and the self-declared theoretical, who despise practice and the physical world and float free in their own dream dimensions of constructs. Both types sever the intellect, sever thought from life, and that is a fundamental Platonic contribution. Even so, Plato says, even though my theory won't work perfectly, it's better than any alternative we have, and therefore let's do it. I should say that he grew progressively more pessimistic about it as he grew older, but he never abandoned it. Now, of course, the truth is that it would not work in practice because the theory on which it's based is defective, opposed to reality. But for that, you need a different metaphysics and epistemology. Now, I want in conclusion to point out to you a fundamental similarity between two schools which on the face of it superficially seem to be the exact opposite, Plato and the Sophists, who have fought each other since from Greece till today. Observe the similarity. The subjectivist skeptic side says we have no standard to resolve disputes among men. The only thing we can resort to in human relations is force. We must become tyrants in politics. The Platonic mystic says truth is accessible only to a privileged few. The mass of men are irrational and need to be dictated to. We have to resort to force in dealing with them. We must have a politics of tyranny. The Sophists say, to hell with theory. We scorn it. Let us feel and kill. Plato says, the intellect will take you only so far, and then let's have a vision and kill. Now, the friends of Plato say this is unfair. After all, they say the Sophists are tyrants in the name of selfishness, whereas the Platonic philosophers dictate in the name of the unselfish welfare of the masses. One kills, if he does, for personal, selfish pleasure, whereas the other kills altruistically for the happiness of society. Now, I don't propose to bargain about this question. You are dead either way. Which brings us to the final question this evening. What about the possibility of a philosophy that would provide the foundation for a third alternative? A philosophy that would say there is one objective reality, this one, that all men can know it by the use of their senses and their reason, that neither subjectivist skepticism nor otherworldly mysticism is true, and thus lay the groundwork for an ethics of man's rational happiness on earth and a politics of individualism and freedom. What about it? Was there one? Yes. And that we will do when we turn to Aristotle. Thank you.